The phoenix sword intent merely let out a mournful cry and was annihilated within the cracks of the heavenly thunder. Attack! Yuan Zhongyu did not hesitate. He activated his nascent soul's hand and Qian Mo's nascent soul's hand, and they both attacked LV Ruochang. In the short moment when the two nascent souls' hands were formed, Ji Hong's more than 70 light red skulls were also unable to withstand the phoenix sword intent. They only managed to swallow half of the sword beam. Another dozen skulls were destroyed by the sword beam. When the sword beam broke through the skull's defense, Ji Hong had no choice but to activate her nascent soul's hand as well. The third large hand swayed with a milky white brilliance. Like the other two large hands, it firmly imprisoned LV Ruochang in all directions. The three large hands grasped LV Ruochang from three different directions. It looked like she would be crushed into pieces in a few breaths' time. Unfortunately, when faced with the simultaneous attack of three nascent souls' hands, LV Ruochang was not as panicked as Qian Mo and the others thought. Instead, she coldly snorted and raised both of her hands. She even slightly crossed her arms in front of her chest. Then, her palms were flat and faced upwards. More than 10 emerald green sword beams were born from her 10 fingers. Wong, a violent tremor spread out from LV Ruochang's body. More than 10 emerald green sword beams quickly circled around LV Ruochang, wrapping her up like a green cocoon. In just an instant, a whirlpool appeared above the light cocoon. That whirlpool was like a morning star, like a bright moon, emitting a faint white brilliance. This brilliance quickly washed down from the light cocoon. In the blink of an eye, the entire light cocoon was split into countless tiny fragments. Within the light cocoon, an inch-long emerald green flying sword flashed with a faint crystal light. It was extremely exquisite. As the small sword let out a thunderous roar, the air within the space sealed by the three nascent soul cultivators began to move. First, it was a strand of air, then a breeze, then a gust of wind, and then a gust of wind. In the end, the heaven and earth spiritual chi within a few miles had formed into a huge gust of wind that rushed into the emerald green flying sword. The hands of the three Yuanian cultivators, which were originally about to close, were now shaking a little. The seal within 100 feet was also gradually loosening. Qian Mo, Yuan Zhongyu, and Ji Hong saw this and were shocked. Qian Mo suddenly realized something and shouted, "Quick, let's quickly circulate our magic power." This female swordsman is too cunning. She wants to use the huge amount of heaven and earth spiritual chi to resist the imprisonment of our nascent soul's hands. As long as she breaks through the imprisonment before the sword is formed, our initial opportunity will be snatched away by her again. Quick! After Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong heard this, they hurriedly circulated their magic power and poured it into the talismans. They used their divine sense to control the nascent soul's hands. This was their last resort to save their lives. Furthermore, they did not believe that the three nascent soul's hands could not kill a third-grade illusory sword cultivator. Unfortunately, how could things go as they imagined? They saw the flying sword rapidly expand. In a moment, it became a slender flying sword that was more than 10 feet long. Not only was the flying sword abnormally green, it had a kind of soaring sword intent and an invincible sharpness that directly rushed towards the three nascent souls' hands. Buzz, buzz, buzz. At the same time that the sword intent soared into the sky, the flying swords that were scattered on the ground of Imo Qingdong Earth City and no longer controlled by any swordsman suddenly flew up from the ground. Each of them let out a trembling sword cry and rushed into the air, landing beside LV Ruochang's transformed flying sword. Even the flying swords in the hands of the swordsmen that were fighting against the three sex cultivators also let out an extreme buzzing sound. They were no longer controlled by the swordsmen and rushed into the air. Like the ownerless flying swords, they landed beside the huge flying sword. Many of the swordsmen did not panic when they lost their flying swords. Instead, they stood respectfully in the air. The sword light around their bodies flashed intensely as they bowed towards the sword to express the respect from the bottom of their hearts. The group of attacking Tao sect cultivators, under the situation where the spiritual chi of heaven and earth was completely disrupted, had various magical treasures. Although their bodies were filled with true essence and had not condensed their golden cores, they were far from being able to rely on the true essence contained within their golden cores to provide magic power. Thus, they could only withdraw their magical treasures and watch from afar. After all, the only things that could decide the outcome of the battle were the illusory swords and golden cores. Their usefulness was already negligible. Tens of thousands of flying swords rushed into the air and clustered around the huge emerald flying sword. That faint sword light overflowed from the flying sword and enveloped all of the flying swords. That kind of sharp, unstoppable aura became even more intense. At this moment, Qian Mo and the other two's nascent soul hands were already grabbing towards the flying sword. The flying sword only paused in midair for a moment before it emitted a blinding brilliance. The entire sword vibrated and pierced towards a nascent soul hand that Qian Mo was controlling. Following the flight of the illusory swords, the tens of thousands of flying swords that were enveloped by the sword light emitted an extremely ear-piercing sword hum and pierced towards the nascent soul hands of Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong. This is bad, seeing how LV Ruochang used the illusory swords to absorb the heaven and earth spiritual chi to forcefully disperse the nascent soul hands. Qian Mo's heart turned cold. He knew that he had fallen into the trap of this sword cultivator. Following that, he saw how LV Ruochang actually used the illusory swords to control tens of thousands of flying swords. With tens of thousands of flying swords flying towards the three nascent soul hands, Qian Mo's heart sank to the bottom. Indeed, on top of the flying swords, a sword aura pierced through the sky and pierced through the air. The sharp whistling sound of the wind could be heard, and the nascent soul hands of Qian Mo and the other two seemed to have been pierced by a needle. In the blink of an eye, the illusory swords had already pierced through the illusory swords and the nascent soul hands. Close! Qian Mo did not dare to delay any longer. Once again, he circulated his spiritual energy, and the huge hands slowly closed together. At the same time, Ji Hong and Yuan Zhongyu also hurriedly chanted incantations. Two huge hands, one on the left and one on the right, slowly closed together. They wanted to grasp the tens of thousands of flying swords in their hands. Seeing the three huge hands closing together, the tens of thousands of flying swords were enveloped within. The cries of the swords and the resplendent sword light were all covered by the huge hands. The entire battlefield instantly quieted down. However, the silence only lasted for a moment. Following the tightening of the illusory swords' hands, tens of hundreds of swordsmen let out miserable cries. Their flying swords were destroyed by the illusory swords, and their primordial spirits were damaged. They could no longer stand still in midair and fell from the sky. Seeing this situation, the faces of the cultivators were filled with joy. There were even tens of young cultivators who were cheering noisily. After all, these three huge hands covered the space of hundreds of feet. The spiritual energy waves emitted from the palms were incomparably dense. With the cultivation of these cultivators, it was impossible for them to measure it. They also knew that this was the powerful technique of a golden core cultivator. In addition, the illusory swords of LV Ruochang and the tens of thousands of flying swords were all wrapped up by the palms. There was no visible movement. How could they not know that these flying swords were all caught by the illusory swords? Even Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong's faces revealed a relaxed expression. Once again, they formed seals in their hands. The illusory swords' hands moved slightly, as if they wanted to crush all the flying swords. Chapter 2592. Fellow Taoists, don't be careless. Qian Mo's face did not relax as he cautiously reminded the two of them. At the same time, he once again channeled his mana in an attempt to shatter LV Ruochang's flying sword. At this moment, a needle-like ray of sword light shot out from the Yuanying's hand. Following that, from the opening, more rays of sword light appeared. After a moment of silence, a loud roar resounded, causing the Yuanying's hand in the center to shake violently. Not good. Qianmo's face suddenly lost all color. The Yuanying's hand seemed to be on the verge of collapse and was about to lose control. Just as Qianmo cried out in alarm, the Yuanying's hand instantly lost its connection with his mind. Rumble! A series of earth-shaking explosions resounded. The jade-green flying sword that was imprisoned by the Yuanying's hand rushed out. The entire Yuanying's hand collapsed, and a sky-piercing shockwave spread out. Not only the group of Foundation establishment cultivators, even Qianmo retreated in panic. Qianmo's Yuanying's hand exploded, and its aura dissipated. The other two Yuanying's hands on his left and right were also affected and shook violently. At this moment, LV Ruochang's flying sword suddenly swept across, and a ray of sword light flashed, slashing at the two Yuanying's hands. Shua! From the two Yuanying's hands, a small ray of sword light shot out. This ray of sword light instantly expanded. Boom, boom, boom. Two consecutive loud sounds could be heard. Yuan Zhongyu's and Ji Hong's Yuanying's hands were similarly destroyed by LV Ruochang's 10,000 swords. On the entire battlefield, waves of air surged into the sky. The corpses of the fallen cultivators and swordsmen were torn apart by this explosive force. Broken limbs flew in all directions, and blood was also scattered in all directions along with the waves of air. Yuan Zhongyu and the rest's faces were slightly pale as they quickly retreated. At the same time, each of their magic treasures flew close to them to prevent LV Ruochang's sneak attack. When the three of them and the rest of the cultivators retreated a few hundred feet, they saw that in the midst of the mess in the air, the Yuanying's flying sword was much smaller than before. Around her, the 10,000 flying swords were also trembling slightly. It was obvious that LV Ruochang had paid a huge price to destroy the three Yuanying's hands. She also lost a lot of sword cultivators. Once the flying sword's Yuanying appeared, it once again and flew across the sky and pierced towards Qianmo. Behind the flying sword, thousands of flying Yuanyings, once again 10,000 flying swords. Yuan Zhongyu's and the Yuanying's S Yuanying's T Yuanying, S's, T to Yuanying. Both of them couldn't help but smile bitterly as they exchanged glances before looking at Qianmo. However, Qianmo's reaction was out of their expectations. Qianmo's eyes narrowed as he stared at the emerald green flying sword that was flying towards him. He actually appeared very calm. Could it be that Qianmo has a backup plan? Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong came to a realization at the same time. However, looking at the 10,000 flying swords, the two of them smiled bitterly. Not daring to wait for Qianmo's backup plan, they each used their own life-saving divine abilities. Ji Hong pointed her finger, and the 70 skeletons circling around her once again pounced over. Ji Hong spat out a mouthful of blood essence. Just like before, these skeletons were fighting for food. Following which, the skeletons glowed red and rushed into Ji Hong's body. At this point, Ji Hong no longer blocked them and allowed them to bite her body. Blood vessels appeared on her Taoist robe. Looking at Ji Hong again, her face was strangely flushed red, following which, her face quickly turned pale. Her originally white hair turned white in an instant, and the wrinkles on her face deepened at a speed visible to the naked eye. In just a few breaths' time, the skeletons that were pouncing on Ji Hong's body were covered in crimson red blood vessels. Compared to before, the skeletons had increased in size by quite a bit. The strangest thing was that their black hole-like eyes were actually glowing red. This red light faintly revealed a kind of viciousness. Ji Hong's body shook and the golden light around her body flashed. The 70 skeletons let out a whimper as if they were unwilling to part with the fresh meat. They actually circled around Ji Hong's body. Ji Hong had no choice but to berate them again. She pointed her finger, and an extremely faint light flashed and landed on all the skeletons. Those skeletons trembled slightly, as if they were extremely afraid of this light, and quickly rushed forward. At the same time, these skeletons were surrounded by traces of bloody light and quickly transformed into different faces. However, these faces were all ferocious. More than 70 heads expanded and blocked in front of Jihong. Their 7 orifices each spat out a red and white light. This light was much stronger than the previous light curtain and was much finer. Yuan Zhongyu glanced at Jihong's technique, and a trace of surprise flashed across his eyes. However, he did not dare to be negligent. He threw the flying sword in his hand and spat out a mouthful of essence blood. Roar! With a loud and clear sound, the flying sword also expanded and turned into the shape of a 3 feet long golden dragon. Its golden coat was flashing with lightning. Yuan Zhongyu seemed to have expended a lot of energy. His entire face was pale. However, the little golden dragon circled above his head, and the 7 thunderclouds in the sky pressed down. Flashes of lightning landed on the little golden dragon. At the same time, the golden dragon became brighter and brighter, and at the same time, it also protected Yuan Zhongyu under it. Looking at Qianmo, who was in the middle, he didn't seem to be panicking at all. He didn't seem to have taken out any special methods either. He merely pointed his finger, and the lightning bolt descended rapidly. Following Qianmo's incantation, the lightning bolt gradually expanded. The pentagram was like a huge spiritual beast, blocking in front of Qianmo. Qianmo couldn't have lost his mind, right? Jihong and Yuan Zhongyu, who had taken out their last life-saving technique, looked at Qianmo in disbelief. With such a method of usage, how could it block the attack of a 3rd-grade illusory swordsman? However, LV Ruochang's 10,000 swords were already close at hand. How could they allow them to remind him? Go! Jihong pointed her finger, and the 70 heads let out a sinister laugh. The red and white lights became brighter and brighter and collided with the flying sword. Kachacha! Countless lightning bolts condensed into a net, layer after layer. Yuan Zhongyu also hurriedly urged his treasure sword. The lightning bolts on the little golden dragon poured down in torrents, blocking the incoming flying sword. Withdraw! Qianmo, who bore the brunt of the attack, was even more direct. He urged the magic power in his body, and the lightning bolts in the sky also fell on the lightning flash. As the lightning flash swayed, the groove that was originally receiving the lightning bolts rushed straight towards LV Ruochang. A huge suction force was generated from the groove. A ray of sword light, like a meteor from outer space, pierced in the lightning flash without hesitation. When the huge lightning bolt struck the flying sword, it could only make the emerald green light of the flying sword become even brighter. A slight cracking sound was produced from the lightning flash. It was obvious that the lightning flash was not a match for LV Ruochang's attack. At this moment, Qianmo, who had a calm expression, became even more indifferent. He suddenly formed a strange incantation and raised his hand. Lightning flashed on his palm, and the lightning bolts that were falling in the lightning flash suddenly turned towards him. Kachacha! The lightning bolt hit Qianmo, but it did not injure him. Instead, it covered his entire body with lightning bolts. Not only that, Qianmo continued to form incantations. His whole body flew up into the sky. When he reached the top of the lightning flash, he pointed his finger. Shua! A clear sound was emitted from the lightning flash. The huge suction force rushed up to the sky. Not only did it cover the dark clouds in the sky, it also covered Qianmo. Taoist Yuan, Taoist Ji. Farewell. Qianmo's indifferent voice sounded in the sky. This is already LV Ruochang's 3rd attack. If I can break it, even if she is not seriously injured, you can still escape from her 10,000 swords. She will definitely not have a reason to chase after you. If I am seriously injured, I ask the 2 of you to lead the men of our 3 sects and kill these unarmed sword cultivators one by one. Taoist Qian. When Yuan Zhongyu and Jihong saw this, How could they not know what Qian and Mo wanted to do? Both of them were greatly moved. There is no need to stop me, and there is also no need to say anything. Qian Mo's figure slowly descended into the lightning flash. Today, I am the center of the three sections. Naturally, I will protect the disciples of the three sects with my own body and kill the sword cultivators with my own body. Immediately, Qian Mo's gaze turned to the south, which seemed to be the direction of the Imperial Thunder sect. He sighed in loneliness. Alas, I have long expected that I would end up like this. Indeed, who can understand my heart? My self-harm is undoubtedly because I have no face to see the old friends of the Sky Thunder Peak and the tens of thousands of disciples of the Imperial Thunder sect. But who can understand my heart? Admittedly, I want the Imperial Thunder sect to be strong, but my strength is weak. Admittedly, no one can understand my heart, but I have no regrets. Admittedly, everyone treats me as a laughingstock, but how can I not know? I have a clear conscience. Everything I do is based on my own understanding. I have my own path of strength. I regret that I can't see the Imperial Thunder sect standing at the peak of the country of Xi in my lifetime. Hi-hu, my path, let me walk. I alone, I have no regrets. I have no regrets. As he spoke, the lightning flashes cracked even more. Qian and Mo chanted, I have no regrets, and his body turned into lightning and fell into the lightning flashes. Fellow Taoist Qian. Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong both cried out in sorrow. At this moment, they didn't have the feeling of a fox grieving for a rabbit's death. Instead, they felt a deep sense of regret. They only thought of Qian and Mo as a stubborn person, a person who abided by the rules, or even a person who pretended to be a person of high morals. Who would have thought that this ordinary cultivator who was looked down upon and ridiculed by others actually had such ambition in his heart? Thinking of Qian Mo's actions in the conference hall, thinking of his so-called collusion with Tu Hong, thinking of what he did to Dui, Qiming, and the others, and thinking of how he revealed Tu Hong's plans and thoughts in the conference hall, as well as how he was forced to be the center of the three paths, Qian and Mo did not hesitate to exchange his life for the tens of thousands of disciples. Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong deeply understood that they had underestimated Qian and Mo. They had underestimated Qian Mo's personality. In Qian Mo's heart, there was a Grand Duke. Chapter 2593. Boom, boom, boom. The lightning flashes suddenly exploded. Although the momentum was not as strong as the Yuanying's hand, this explosion was still caused by Qian Mo's self-destruction of his physical body and his natal magical treasure. The target was very clear, and the area was also very concentrated. The space around a few dozen feet to the left shook violently, and the silent ripples pushed everyone back a few dozen feet. In the midst of this ripple, the 10,000 swords that were piercing towards Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong suddenly stopped and quietly stopped in midair. At the place where the splendor was, countless lightning bolts burst out. Following the lightning bolts, Lu Ruochang's figure appeared. His sword was damaged, his face was pale, and there was even a faint trace of fear in his eyes. It was obvious that under Qian Mo's life-risking attack, Lu Ruochang was unable to maintain his sword form and was even seriously injured. Oomph. Lu Ruochang's cold voice sounded. This sword is a man of his words. The 3 moves that I said earlier have already passed. 2 of you are still alive. Since you all have dodged, this sword will spare your lives. You can go back later. Hearing the words of the 3rd-grade illusory swordsman, the cultivators of the 3 sects who were waiting nearby all had expressions of joy on their faces. This Lu Ruochang's sword form was really too powerful and had already scared everyone to death. Now that they saw a chance of survival, how could they not be happy? Even the golden core cultivator as strong as Ji Hong hurriedly waved her hand. In front of the 10,000 swords, the 70 or so heads flew back and raised their hands to give the order. But at this time, Yuan Zhongyu smiled faintly and said, "It seems that the 3 moves have not been completed yet. The move just now can only be considered as half of the 2nd move. This old man is not talented. I will take the 3rd move." "What?" Ji Hong was shocked. Although she still had magic power in her body, it had already been exhausted. How could she fight against a third-grade, illusory swordsman? However, when Ji Hong saw Yuan Zhongyu's calm expression and looked at the 10,000 flying swords floating quietly in front of her, a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. At the same time, she raised her eyebrows and coldly said, "That's right. Senior Qian Mo used his life to help us dodge the second move. We are already prepared to receive your third move." Kill. Yuan Zhongyu didn't wait for Ji Hong to finish speaking. He raised his hand, and the sword that had transformed into a little golden dragon roared. The 7 dark clouds in the sky flashed with lightning and struck down at LV Ruochang. Seeing this, LV Ruochang's eyes flashed with a trace of shame and anger. Her body emitted an extremely weak sword light, and her figure could no longer support itself in the air. She fell from more than 10 meters. At the same time, the thousands of flying swords hanging around her fell together, just like fallen leaves swept by the autumn wind. Senior brother Qian Mo has already injured this bastard. This was the perfect time to kill her. Everyone, for the heroic death of Qian Mo, for the great victory of our Dao sect. Kill. Seeing this, Yuan Zhongyu knew that his guess was correct. Wherever the sword pointed, numerous lightning bolts struck down, hitting the place where LV Ruochang's body fell. LV Ruochang was almost unable to deal with the lightning bolts that were easily deflected. Her body swayed twice, and with lightning bolts lingering around her, she urged the flying swords under her feet to escape towards the northwest in an extremely sorry state. As for the remaining 10,000 swordsmen, seeing their flying swords falling from the sky, they hurriedly urged their sword energy to connect with their flying swords. However, many of the Dao sect cultivators were already moved by Qian Mo's death without hesitation. Seeing that there was a chance to avenge him, they couldn't help but feel agitated. They urged their energy to their utmost, and the light from their magical treasures shot towards the unarmed swordsmen. The swordsmen were already at a disadvantage, and now they were in an even more sorry state. Those with high cultivation could still retrieve their flying swords and step on them, following closely behind LV Ruochang's departing figure. Those with low cultivation couldn't retrieve their flying swords in time, and could only urge their sword energy to fly out. However, their bodies were much slower, and the thousands of magical treasures of the cultivators had already been smashed to the ground. Another 60% of the swordsmen had fallen here. Kill! Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong shouted. They took the lead and flew up, ignoring the swordsmen. Each of them held a treasure in their hands and constantly channeled their magic power. They wanted to catch up with LV Ruochang and kill him on the spot. However, it was obvious that the flying techniques of the swordsmen were superior to those of the Dao sect cultivators, not to mention LV Ruochang, who was at the 3rd grade of the illusory sword. In the blink of an eye, she was already far away, and it seemed that with Yuan Zhongyu and Ji Hong's flying speed, it would be difficult to catch up with her. However, Yuan Zhongyu raised his eyebrows and cried out in joy, "Fellow Taoist Ji, look, isn't LV Ruochang escaping towards the sword catacomb?" "That's right, it's the sword catacomb." Ji Hong didn't understand Yuan Zhongyu's joy. If the swordsmen were defeated, wouldn't they be escaping towards the sword catacomb? Could it be that they have a better place to go? Haha, Yuan Zhongyu laughed and said, "Fellow Taoist Ji, there's something you don't know." Following which, Yuan Zhongyu repeated Qian Mo's suggestion. He pointed with his finger and said confidently, "Senior brother Qian Mo is indeed a deity. His calculations are flawless. As long as the swordsmen are defeated and enter the sword catacomb, the 10-direction annihilation array set up by Black Sky Sect's fellow Taoist Xiong Huasong will be able to kill them all." And fellow Taoist Qian has such a great ability? Ji Hong didn't know that the dozens of sects on duty in the conference hall had such an incredible hidden card. She couldn't help but exclaim, "He could actually predict the defeat of the swordsman today." This is also part of that old man, Tu Hong's plan. Yuan Zhongyu couldn't help but sigh. It was used by senior brother Qianmo. That day in the conference hall, I felt that it was inconceivable. How could the swordsman be defeated so easily? But who knew that senior brother Qianmo's plan would actually work today? If senior brother Qianmo didn't endure the humiliation and get along well with Tu Hong, how could he have such a plan? Fellow Taoist G, previously I really wronged senior brother Qianmo. Not only did I wrong senior brother Qianmo, I really wronged him. Ji Hong replied without hesitation. That day in the marriage alliance between the Imperial Thunder sect and the Sky Patrol City, I even ridiculed senior brother Qianmo for a long time. I always treated him like a clown. Even in the conference hall, senior brother Qianmo's performance made me feel that he was too pedantic and unfit to be the representative of the Imperial Thunder sect. But today, it seems that I was wrong. Senior brother Qianmo's thinking is far beyond what I can imagine. His breadth of mind is also beyond my imagination. Yuan Zhongyu nodded. The good and bad of a person can't be judged simply by a few things. It also can't be judged from our own eyes. It can only be judged at the moment of life and death. Although senior brother Qianmo has some shortcomings, these shortcomings are nothing compared to his strength of sacrificing himself for a noble cause. That's right, Ji Hong replied as she used her spiritual sense to scan the surroundings. She smiled and said, senior brother Qianmo's death can be considered to have some results. More than half of the swordsmen have been killed, and Lu Ruochang has also fled in a sorry state. Now that we are chasing after Lu Ruochang, we can report this matter to the other fellow Taoists and let them know of senior brother Qianmo's ambition. That's right. If we can kill all the swordsmen in the Sword Catacomb, the Imperial Thunder sect will have the greatest merit in this battle. As Yuan Zhongyu spoke, he called over a dozen disciples and recorded everything he said into a jade slip. He then passed it to the disciples who were sending the message. After the disciples scattered and flew away, he then ordered the disciples of the three sects to form a formation and set off towards the Sword Catacomb. Within the Sword Catacomb, a crack appeared in the huge silver ball of light. From within, a layer of misty azure brilliance seeped out. Once the brilliance came into contact with the air, a sizzling sound could be heard. If one looked closely, it was a trace of thin ice shards slowly falling down. This azure brilliance was actually so cold. Following the appearance of the crack, the azure light above the silver ball of light flourished. A clear and cold voice floated out from the crack. "Yu Qing Tian Sect Master, aren't you being too impatient?" Following this voice, a tall woman wearing a strange sword robe appeared from the crack. It was Zhang Yuhe from the Xian Sword Sect who had disappeared for several years. At this moment, Zhang Yuhe's entire body was overflowing with azure light. That azure light not only appeared on the surface of her body, but also seeped out from the pores of her body. It was as if her entire body was an azure flying sword. Even when the azure light inadvertently flowed out, the strange sword rune would appear from time to time. It was unclear whether it was inherent to the azure light or unintentionally formed. Little friend Zhang, Yu Qing Tian didn't care about Zhang Yue's indifference. He only said kindly, "It's not that this old man is impatient. It's just that at this moment, outside the Sword Catacomb, the swordsmen of the Huan country and the cultivators of the three countries are fighting fiercely. I don't know how many lives have been lost here. If our cooperation can be completed earlier, wouldn't there be fewer cultivators and swordsmen dying? Hee, when has Sect Master Yu been so benevolent? If Sect Master Yu is really benevolent, why don't you remove the restriction on this sword? As long as this sword appears in the Sword Catacomb, the warriors of my sword domain will know that this sword is still alive in this world. Then, the war between cultivators will naturally end. Why wait until our cooperation ends?" As she spoke, Zhang Yuhe raised her arm. A few silver crystal threads appeared on her arm. The silver brilliance on the crystal threads shone brightly, covering Zhang Yue's arm and half of her waist. "This old man naturally wants to let you go back earlier." Yu Qing Tian didn't seem to feel embarrassed. He only smiled and said, "But our cooperation hasn't been completed yet. How can this old man let you go?" If you go out and don't come back, wouldn't this old man's decades of hard work be in vain? This sword can naturally make a sword oath that when the war is over, I will come back to the sword catacomb. Zhang Yuhe replied, "The warriors of my sword domain have always been true to their words, unlike you cultivators of the Tao sect." Chapter 2594. Ha ha ha. My young friend Zhang. Yu Qing Tian laughed. In this world, if there is no betrayal and no betrayal, what is the use of the blood oath and the sword oath? However, how can the sword oath and the blood oath be compared to the control in your own hands? If you don't fulfill the sword oath and return to the sword tomb, and instead bring the sect master of your Xianjian sect to the sword tomb to look for me, what should I do? If I don't fulfill the sword oath, then how can sect master you help me cultivate the extreme Yin constitution? Help me cultivate the 6 directions Yin spirit through the blood sacrifice? A mysterious smile appeared on Zhang Yue's lips. Yu Qingtian raised his white eyebrows and said without hesitation, "Don't you want to cultivate the 6 directions Yin spirit yourself? Don't you want to break through the illusory sword realm and enter the sword transformation realm? In my opinion, even if I let you go now, I'm afraid you won't leave." Zhang Yuhe did not speak for a long time. After a long while, she sighed and said, "Yes. Entering the sword transformation realm is the lifelong pursuit of the swordsman of the sword region. The great yin-yang 6-direction sword spirit is another shortcut. In just a few decades, although this sword has not cultivated the great yin-yang 6-direction sword spirit, just by relying on this extreme yin constitution and the communication with the 6 directions yin spirit, my entire body can already transform into a simple sword. If I can cultivate the 6 directions yin spirit, I can immediately take a peek at the sword transformation realm. When the yin spirit and this sword become one, it will definitely stabilize the sword transformation realm. In the future, the spiritual sword and divine sword can definitely be expected. Even if sect master you want me to leave now, I will definitely not leave. Yes, if you leave, won't your decades of hard work and pain be in vain? Yu Qingtian nodded and said, "My decades of hard work will also be in vain." Yu Qingtian paused for a moment and said, "In order to cultivate your extreme Yin constitution, I used the power of the whole family to find the mysterious Yin spirit grass and the great Yang dragon root, as well as countless rare treasures. This old man has invested more than little friend." Sect master you. Do you think I don't know about this? You don't have to say it again and again. Are you reminding me to be grateful? Zhang Yuhe sneered. If you don't have my incomplete sword slip, do you know what the spirit of the great yin-yang 6-direction sword is? Do you know how to cultivate a sword spirit? Furthermore, if this sword were to refine a 6 directions yin spirit, wouldn't your Yu family be able to refine a 6 directions yang spirit as well? Wasn't he able to cultivate a sword transformation disciple whose cultivation base was comparable to that of a nascent soul stage cultivator? Your Yu family's harvest seems to be much more than mine, right? That's right. Yu Qingtian did not wait for Zhang Yuhe to say anything and directly admitted, "That's why I used the strength of my entire clan to cooperate with you, little friend. That's why you and I could work together for decades." However, Zhang Yuhe did not let it go and continued, "Didn't the cultivation method of the great yin-yang 6-direction sword spirit also remain in the Yu family? In the future, when you meet a suitable disciple, you can even cultivate a swordsman. Isn't this my contribution? Isn't this my sincerity? Sect master, you actually imprisoned this sword here for dozens of years." Old friend Zhang, it's pointless to talk about it now." Although Yu Qingtian's face was all smiles, his tone was somewhat cold. "Little friend, your sword slip only has the technique to cultivate a sword spirit, but it doesn't have a method to change one's physique, right? This profound phoenix physique is a secret technique passed down in my Yu family. Even the top sects in the 3 kingdoms of cultivation may not have such a strange technique, let alone sword cultivators from your Huan kingdom, right? If it weren't for little friend's sincerity in cooperating with me, how could I take it out? Little friend, I've seen your cultivation advance by leaps and bounds all the way from the drawing sword stage to the second grade of the illusory sword stage. This seems to be the result of my Yu family's secret technique, right? Not to mention, if it weren't for the disciples of my Yu family who discovered the formation when you fell into the sword tomb that day, I'm afraid you would have. That formation was your Yu family's trap. Don't think that this sword doesn't know. Zhang Yuhe said angrily. This sword admits that your body-refining technique is indeed useful, but if you don't have the technique to communicate with the sword spirit, how can you improve your cultivation? Didn't an ordinary disciple of your Yu family cultivate from the Qi refinement stage all the way to the late stage of the foundation establishment stage under this sword's secret technique? When a Liuhe Yang spirit is cultivated, he can also easily step into the gold core stage. Isn't this secret technique 100 times more useful than your profound phoenix technique? Yes, Yu Qingtian saw that Zhang Yuhe was angry and said with a smile, I admit all these. Otherwise, why would I continue to cooperate with little friend? However, I still have to say that the sword formation you fell into was definitely not set up by my Yu family. It was really a formation left behind by the sword tomb. Little friend returned to Huan Kingdom in a hurry that day and accidentally touched the restriction. Hearing Yu Qingtian's soft words and mentioning the restriction that day, Zhang Yuhe's cold expression was a little strange, and even her eyes flashed with melancholy. She sighed and said, Sect Master Yu, is there still no news of my sister Zhang Yutong? Of course there isn't. Yu Qingtian said without hesitation. When I was cooperating with you, I had already told you the news of the three kingdoms without hiding anything. As long as my Yu family knew the whereabouts of Duan Yuming and the others from the Xinjian sect, we would definitely not hide anything. If I knew the news of Zhang Yutong, I would definitely tell you immediately. I hope so, Zhang Yuhe said faintly. This sword is a little selfish. If it weren't for the cooperation with you, this sword would have already passed the news to my sect master. Little friend, you don't have to worry about this. The cooperation between you and me is mutually beneficial. The news of Zhang Yutong won't affect our cooperation. Why wouldn't I tell you? Yu Qingtian comforted. Besides, your Xinjian sect must have received your previous message to send illusory swordsmen to the three kingdoms to look for you. Otherwise, why would they go directly to Meng Kingdom? As for whether you go back or not, it's the same. Also, didn't I tell you clearly? Your message and your escape. It's very likely that those unknown cultivators did it on purpose. What they're after? It's not shallow. This old man was only guessing that day. Now that the Dao cultivators are fighting, this old man's guess should be confirmed. Then why did Lu Weigang start a war between cultivators? It doesn't mean anything to him. Zhang Yuhe sneered. He's just a foundation establishment cultivator. He's just an ant. It's still too early to talk about it. I think there must be a real conspiracy brewing after this war. Yu Qingtian seemed to be pointing something out. Zhang Yuhe was concerned and asked, How is the war between cultivators now? Is it my sword realm or your Taoist sect that has the upper hand? In order to show my sincerity, as long as you want to know, I won't hide any information from you. Don't you know the situation of the war? Yu Qingtian said with a smile. According to Sect Master Yu's battle report, my sword realm naturally has the upper hand. Zhang Yuhe frowned and said, But this is poles apart from my estimation. Little friend, you're not at the front of the battle. How do you know the changes in the situation? Yu Qingtian said disapprovingly. Now, the sword cultivators of Huan Kingdom have already passed the sword tomb and are about to advance to the vicinity of Sky Patrol City. If it weren't for Shui Yuzhenren, I'm afraid they would have attacked Sky Patrol City. Isn't this the result that Sect Master Yu wants? Zhang Yuhe sneered. I'm really contradicting myself now. Yu Qingtian said with a smile. I'm a cultivator of the country of Shi. Naturally, I hope that my Taoist sect cultivators will win. However, our plan is carried out in the Sword Tomb. This war between cultivators is really fast, and it takes a lot of time for you to refine the sword spirit. If my Taoist sect defeats the sword cultivators, It's inevitable that we'll fight our way to the Sword Tomb. Although the Sword Tomb is huge and the chances of finding you and me are slim, little friend's Great Six Directions Yin-Yang Sword Spirit is completed. There must be some changes in the sky. It's impossible that it won't attract the attention of the sword cultivators and the Taoist sect cultivators. It's extremely disadvantageous for both you and me. Isn't this what Sect Master Yu wants? Zhang Yuhe sneered. This war is far away from the Sword Tomb. Even if there's chaos here, it has nothing to do with the war. Of course not. Yu Qingtian shook his head. I'm naturally concerned about the war. I've already said before that there's something strange about this war. It's very likely that something strange will happen soon. At this point, he frowned slightly. Then, he smiled and said, However, I'm only concerned about the war. This strange thing has nothing to do with you and my Yu family. When you've completed the Great Six Directions Yin-Yang Sword Spirit and stepped into the Sword Transformation realm, not only will it bring glory to the sect, but it will also be easy for you to avenge Zhang Yutong. That's right. Zhang Yuhe gritted her teeth. This is also my plan. I want to use the power of the Sword Transformation realm to kill Lu Weigang and the Foundation Establishment cultivator behind him. Otherwise, no matter how Sect Master you threatened or tempted me that day, I will never agree to it. Yes. Yu Qingtian smiled apologetically. I also hate cultivators who pretend to be obedient but secretly plot against me. That's why I'm helping you. No matter which sect you're from, as long as you leave the Sword Tomb as a Sword Transformation Realm cultivator, which nascent soul cultivator in the 3 cultivation countries will dare to disrespect you? Avenging Zhang Yutong will be a piece of cake. Zhang Yuhe snorted coldly. Her eyes flashed with hatred. I just don't know. When will you start condensing the blood spirit for the 6th time? Yu Qingtian finally asked tentatively. Alas, Sect Master Yu, it's not that I'm not in a hurry. Zhang Yuhe sighed and waved her hand. A green brilliance condensed in front of her, and a flying sword more than a foot long appeared in the air. The flying sword flashed with sword light, and its shape was indistinct. The threatening sword intent actually caused Yu Qingtian's Taoist robe to flutter in the wind. He said, To be honest, I'm 100 times more anxious than you are. I don't know whether my twin sister is dead or alive, so I can only hide here and practice hard. I can't do anything for her. My heart is tormented every day, and I can't wait to condense the Great Six Directions Yin-Yang Sword Spirit now. Chapter 2595. Although the Great Yin-Yang Six Directions Sword Spirit is not difficult to cultivate, and 2 swordsmen with extreme Yin and extreme Yang constitutions can barely cultivate it with some secret techniques. However, if one really cultivates it to the point where it can move unhindered and cut off all Yin and Yang in the void, it will not be a simple matter. It can even be said to be impossible. Although my 10,000 spirits blood sacrifice technique cannot cultivate the great Yin-Yang Six Directions sword spirit to the extreme, if it can really be cultivated, it will definitely not be difficult to kill a nascent soul cultivator. However, I've already told the sect master about the 10,000 spirit blood sacrifice. We'll select 99,999 Foundation Establishment cultivators, and 20% of them will be disciples with pure 5 elements physiques. After that, we'll have to go through 6 60-year cycles of refinement before we succeed. Zhang Yuhe did not wait for Yu Qingtian to say anything and argued very eloquently, as if she was bargaining. That's impossible. Yu Qingtian shook his head. Not to mention that the harsh physiques of these 100,000 cultivators cannot be satisfied. Even 6 cycles of refinement is impossible. Yes, Zhang Yuhe said helplessly. Then we can only simplify it. We don't need those with 5 elements physiques. Just cultivators will do. We don't need 6 cycles of refinement. We only need these few decades. But the blood spirits of those 99,999 cultivators, they absolutely couldn't be left out. Without enough blood spirits, the Yin-Yang sword spirit will not be able to grow. And how can it form the 6 direction sword spirit? Little friend, Yu Qingtian smiled bitterly. In these few decades, I have already provided nearly 70,000 blood spirits. Although the quality of the blood spirits varies, but at least there are some, right? How long do you think my U family can take the lives of so many cultivators? If any part of it is accidentally leaked, my U family will definitely not have the chance to establish itself in the Dawn Rain continent. The three kingdoms of cultivation. Won't those cultivation sects completely wipe out my Yu family? Zhang Yuha smiled faintly again. Sect Master Yu, if you were not in the sword tomb that day, if you did something that triggered the blood spirits, how could I detect it? How could I be trapped in the sword formation? Moreover, you did not hesitate at all for the first blood sacrifice and arranged it in an extremely short period of time. Do you think I would not know? Yu Qingtian only chuckled and did not answer. Don't worry, Sect Master Yu. This sword will only speak of this matter in front of the Sect Master and will absolutely not speak of it to a third person. This matter is also related to my safety. Zhang Yuha waved her hand again, and the azure flying sword immediately jumped up and danced around her like a dragonfly. Now, this great yin-yang six directions sword spirit has already undergone 5 blood sacrifices and is about to reach perfection. This last blood sacrifice is also very important. If it succeeds, this sword can immediately step into the 3rd grade of the illusory sword and see the sword transformation realm, and that disciple of yours can immediately step into the gold core realm. However, if there is even the slightest mistake, not only will this sword and your disciples' lives be in danger, but everything from before will also be for naught. This sword cannot afford to be careless. You don't need to remind me. Yu Qingtian nodded and said, this old man already knew, but after 5 blood sacrifices, this old man really can't gather so many blood spirits in the Dawn Rain continent. This time, I used up all the resources of the Yu family and spent nearly 5 years to barely find enough blood spirits. However, if this little friend still can't carry out the blood sacrifice, this old man is afraid that there will be a change in the situation. When that time comes, no one will answer you even if you beg the heavens and the earth. All right, Zhang Yuha hesitated for a moment and finally nodded. Sect Master, give this sword another month. This sword will properly refine this 6 directions sword spirit. When it is slightly perfect, I will inform Sect Master. All right, Yu Qingtian heaved a sigh of relief and cupped his hands. This matter is beneficial to both of us. Little friend, I will have to trouble you to do it. Of course. Zhang Yuha opened her mouth, and the azure flying sword suddenly entered it. The azure color of the entire silver ball of light brightened, and the gap slowly closed again. Zhang Yuha raised her eyes to look at the ball of light that was entwined with crimson fire threads and said, your nephew's aptitude is indeed not bad, but it's a pity that his cultivation is still too shallow. When you urge this sword, don't forget to remind him. If his 6 directions yang spirit is not perfect, just relying on this sword to make up for it and bring him into the gold core realm. I'm afraid that the entire great yin-yang 6 direction sword spirit will only have a 40% chance of success. This sword is unwilling to carry out the last blood sacrifice because of him. Yes, I will have to trouble you to worry about this matter. This disciple is also the most outstanding disciple of the Yu family. Although his cultivation is shallow, his physique is inclined towards extreme yang. Otherwise, this old man wouldn't dare to hand him over to you. Yu Qingtian nodded in agreement. Yes, Sect Master is right. If it weren't for his extreme yang physique, why would this sword be willing to cultivate the 6 directions yang spirit with him? Zhang Yuha nodded proudly. As she spoke, the azure light around Zhang Yuha surged out from her skin and wrapped around her entire head. It was very similar to an azure cocoon, but there were still traces of blood on this azure cocoon, just like the azure brilliance in the silver ball of light. Yu Qingtian's eyes revealed a thoughtful expression. He clapped his hands again and took out the tiger-shaped magic weapon, sealing the gap in the ball of light. After waiting for a moment, he pointed his finger again, and the magic weapon spat out a silver brilliance again. The brilliance was like a silver net that landed on the ball of light and quickly merged into it before disappearing. Then, Yu Tian waved the magic weapon and used the same incantation to open the silver ball of light that was suffused with crimson threads on the left. A crimson brilliance flashed in the silver gap, and streaks of seemingly scorching red rushed out of the gap, almost igniting the air. Great-grandfather! An equally crisp voice sounded, and a handsome young man flashed out from the gap. This young man was wearing a silver Taoist robe, and red light lingered around his body. Streaks of red light were like tiny pythons that flowed around the surface of the young man's body. Even when the young man spoke, red light was swallowing and spitting out from his mouth and nose. However, just like Yu Tian, this young man's eyes were extremely close to silver and didn't change with the crimson brilliance around his body. Yu Tian smiled and said, "How's the sacrificial refining of the six directions, Yang spirit?" This young man was actually the Yu Tong that Xiaohua had been thinking about for a long time. He was also the Yu Tong who had forced Xiaohua out of the Huanhua sect and was preparing to send Xiaohua to his death in the Sword Tomb. However, at this time, Yu Tong's cultivation was already at the middle stage of the Foundation establishment realm, and it seemed that he wasn't much worse than Xiaohua, especially his handsome and youthful appearance. He had already surpassed Xiaohua's. Thank you for your concern, great-grandfather. Yu Tong bowed and said with a smile, "Everything is under the boy's control. There won't be any mistakes." Great-grandfather? All right then. A benevolent smile appeared on Yu Tian's face, and his divine sense swept across Yu Tong's body. That scorching feeling was transmitted to him along with his divine sense. Yu Tian didn't dare to examine carefully, and hurriedly withdrew his divine sense and said, "Our Yu family originally wanted to borrow the massive amount of broken swords and the accumulated gold-attributed spiritual chi of heaven and earth to carry out the ritual of turning stone into gold, helping you and other disciples with suitable aptitudes to improve their physiques. But we didn't expect that we would actually meet Zhang Yuha, a sword cultivator. This refining technique of the great six directions yin-yang sword spirit is not only useful to you, but also to the future generations of our Yu family, right?" Yu Tong pondered for a moment and nodded, saying, "Great-grandfather is right. This is a great opportunity for our Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain, and also a contribution great-grandfather has made to our Yu family. This refining technique of the great six directions yin-yang sword spirit is indeed complete and can be used as our Yu family's ancestral secret technique in the future." "Great. Now that you've said so, this old man is relieved." Yu Tian seemed to trust Yu Tong very much, and a trace of joy appeared on his face. However, Yu Tong changed the topic again, saying, "However, this great six directions yin-yang sword spirit is easy to refine, but if it's cultivated to the extreme like Zhang Yuha, it's too dangerous and extravagant. Our Yu family can only take the risk once. It's not like turning stone into gold, which can be done once every few decades. If we do it too often, it'll be easily discovered by other cultivation sections. Not to mention other sects, even the Washflower sect won't tolerate us. As for the reputation of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain, there's no need to mention it again. This old man will only do this once in his life. It's not my turn to worry about the future." Yu Tian laughed again. "This old man will be able to face the ancestors of the Yu family in the underworld without feeling ashamed after doing this. As for the rest, this old man doesn't dare to think too much." Great-grandfather is too modest." Yu Tong smiled faintly. Boy has succeeded in his cultivation. How can he forget everything great-grandfather has done? It's a pity that great-grandfather's physique is a little weak, and that Zhang Yuha can't cooperate with great-grandfather. Otherwise, this great six directions yin-yang spirit would be great-grandfather's, and great-grandfather's nascent soul stage would be great-grandfather's. As he spoke, Yu Tong blew a breath like Zhang Yuha. A red light flashed, and a small sword fell in midair. Yu Tong flicked his hand, and the small sword immediately turned into 64 flying swords, rushing out like a flame. The entire square outside the light ball was extremely hot. Oh, Yu Qingtian was slightly startled. He stretched out his hand, and a palm-sized shield flew out. Yu Qingtian grabbed his hand, and a silver-white brilliance flashed between his palms. The entire shield suddenly expanded and blocked the 64 flying swords. Ha! Great-grandfather is testing this boy. A smile appeared on Yu Tong's face, and an indescribable spell appeared in his hand. It was somewhat similar to a sword spell, but it was a little different. Buzz! The 64 flying swords roared at the same time, and sparks flew out from each of them. The 64 flying swords condensed into a ball of flame and rushed toward the shield. Puff! There was only a soft sound, and a silver light flashed on the shield. The flames disappeared, and the shield was as if it was nothing. A hole a few feet in size appeared on the shield. It's really so powerful? Yu Qingtian almost couldn't believe his eyes. He stared straight at the small sword that had turned into a scarlet-red, invisible sword. He was really a little envious. Chapter 2596. All right, I'll let you know. Yu Tong didn't look pleased at all. He explained, the so-called Great Yin Yang Six Directions Sword Spirit is a sword spirit born from the blood of 100,000 living beings. This sword spirit already has intelligence. Against great-grandfather's Dharma artifact, this sword spirit was able to find a weakness of the Dharma artifact's Dharma array in a short period of time. It also found the weakness of the Dharma artifact's material to attack. This sword spirit is originally an object of extreme yang. Against a magic weapon, won't it be killed in one hit? Of course, at this moment, the Six Directions Yang spirit has yet to truly merge with it. This flying sword is only tainted with some of the spiritual intelligence of the Six Directions Yang spirit. If it's a flying sword that's truly merged with the Six Directions Yang spirit, then it's truly powerful. This sword spirit has yet to truly merge with the sword spirit, but it's already so powerful. Yu Qingtian was really shocked. Then he realized, isn't this the spiritual weapon of our Taoist sect? That's right. You can say that. Yu Tong nodded and said, it's precisely because of the 100,000 blood sacrifice that such a sword spirit was born. This is a sword spirit that truly has spiritual intelligence. Sword cultivation is far from as simple as we Taoist cultivators think. With a spiritual weapon as the body and a sword spirit and primordial spirit as the spirit, I'm afraid it's really comparable to a soul formation cultivator. Yu Qingtian nodded. If you hadn't obtained this opportunity and cultivated the yin-yang sword spirit with Zhang Yuhe, I'm afraid our Taoist sect wouldn't have known the mystery behind it in the end. After all, I'm cultivating the sword with Taoism. Compared to Zhang Yuhe, I'm still lacking in understanding. She didn't hide anything when she cultivated the sword spirit, but I still can't suppress her in terms of sword spirit. Yu Tong reminded, Great-grandfather, you have to be careful of her hidden tricks. Yu Qingtian furrowed his brows. She doesn't dare to hide it now because of the sword oath she made earlier. Furthermore, the Six Directions Yang spirit that you nurtured has to complement her Six Directions Yin spirit. If your sword spirit is far inferior to hers, how can she cultivate her Yin spirit to perfection? Naturally, you don't have to worry too much about this. However, with your ability, can't you detect her hidden tricks? How can I detect them? This Zhang Yuhe isn't someone easy to deal with. Yu Tong narrowed his eyes and said coldly, she passed through the sword tomb to report back to the Xinjiang sect. At that time, her twin sister Zhang Yutong's life was in danger. Although my Yu family did something to turn stone into gold in the sword tomb, the trace of blood spirit chi and sword chi was not too obvious, but she was able to sense it. Moreover, if they were ordinary people who cared about the safety of their loved ones, why would they take the risk of going to the sword tomb to investigate? They would hide far away and return to the Xian sword sect to report the news. Only after receiving news of the safety of their loved ones would they come back to check. She, on the other hand, barged in directly and landed in the remnant formation of the sword mound. Why would she care about Zhang Yutong's life? Yes, this old man thinks so too. If not for the fact that she wanted to refine the great Yin Yang Six Directions sword spirit herself, how could she have fallen into the formation? Yu Qing Tian nodded. But she has already discovered my Yu family's plan, so how can this old man let her go? This time, my Yu family was forced to imprison her, and she can be considered as one of the initiators of the war between Tao cultivators. If this matter is known by immortal Jing Huan and Fairy by Hua of the Rinsing Flower sect, the future of my falling gold mountain will be bleak. Hee, why would the two seniors of the Rinsing Flower sect worry about such a trivial matter? The other seniors in charge of the actual situation only need to know what to do. Yutong said with a smile. Hee, that's the best. This old man doesn't need to worry about anything in the future. Yu Qing Tian said with a smile. However, you don't need to worry too much about Zhang Yua. This old man has already taken precautions before cooperating with her, so I'm not afraid that she can escape from my grasp. Great-grandfather's calculation is the most powerful. Otherwise, my falling gold mountain wouldn't be so powerful. If I establish a sect in the future, you will be the one who will contribute the most. Yutong said with a smile. Yu Qing Tian hurriedly waved his hand. What this old man has done is nothing. Oh. At this moment, a strange look appeared on Yutong's face, and he asked curiously, Great-grandfather, did you seal Zhang Yuha's sword spirit well? Of course. Yu Qing Tian was shocked and hurriedly said, Every time I see her, I have to activate Jade Tiger's restriction to prevent her from understanding the movements within the Brahma gold magic formation. Why? Could it be that you've sensed something? Yutong's gaze fell on the connection between the two light masses. There are two extremely thin crystal threads, one red and the other green, intertwined with each other, appearing and disappearing from time to time. Yutong pointed at the crystal threads and said thoughtfully, but Jade Tiger's restriction is still not enough. This crystal thread, I'm afraid it can allow her to sense some movements within the magic formation. That makes sense. Yu Qing Tian looked at the crystal threads, which were like tentacles of the light masses. They trembled slightly as if they were breathing. You'd better practice your sword spirit. This old man won't disturb you. Yes, this boy knows. Yutong opened his mouth, and the crimson sword light fell into his mouth with a whoosh. Then, the red light around him lingered, and the cracks on the light masses gradually merged. There was no need for Yu Qing Tian to activate them with Jade Tiger. When the silver light masses closed, the crimson brilliance danced on the light masses like the trajectory of stars. Yu Qing Tian's gaze fell on the two faintly discernible crystal threads. He narrowed his eyes and looked at them for a long time. In the end, he did not dare to make any strange movements. With a wave of his sleeve, he sat cross-legged in front of the light masses and entered a meditative state. Time passed extremely quickly, and the situation of the entire battlefield had taken a shocking turn. It was far beyond Yu Qing Tian and Zhang Yuha's expectations. Not only were the sword cultivators unable to attack Sky Patrol City, but most of the sword cultivators who invaded the kingdom of Shi were defeated by the Taoist sect's cultivators. The sword cultivators who were guarding the Spirit Stone veins and big cities like Clear Cave all fled in panic. Even if a small number of swordsmen managed to block the cultivators' frenzied attacks, when they received various unfavorable news of their defeat, they could not hold on any longer. They retreated as they fought and were defeated in the direction of the sword catacomb. The Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall did not have any disciples patrolling the vicinity of the sword catacomb. They did not notice the decrease in the number of sword cultivator disciples, so they did not know the change in the sword cultivator disciple strategy. Even the sword cultivator disciples themselves did not know where some of the swordsmen had gone. Just like the Taoist sect's cultivators, they did not know that Black Sky sect's Xiong Huasong had already set up the 10 Forces Annihilation formation in the sword catacomb according to Tu Hong's idea and Qian Mo's suggestion. Of course, after many of the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall exchanged messages with each other, They learned that the swordsmen had been defeated. They were proud of themselves, but at the same time, they became suspicious. After all, the sword cultivators had invaded the kingdom of Shi and the kingdom of Huan for a long time. How could they be defeated so easily? Hence, while they were chasing after the sword cultivators, they once again sent messages to discuss. At this time, the various sects that were guarding the meeting hall could no longer hide the truth. They secretly revealed the arrangement of the magic formation that they had set up in the sword catacomb. Of course, this disclosure was also selective. Within a very small range, not all of the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall knew about it. However, all of the Golden Core cultivators who knew the truth were simply overjoyed. Although they felt a little bitter in their hearts, they felt that these fellow cultivators in the meeting hall did not discuss it with them. This was obviously looking down on them, but at the same time, they understood that this matter was not suitable for others to know. Moreover, this arrangement was really unimaginable. If everyone knew about it, how could it be considered a secret? Hence, the Golden Core cultivators did not suspect anything. Even if the swordsmen had set up some arrangements in the sword catacomb, they had already set up the magic formation. How could they not pursue and kill? Furthermore, according to the battle reports from various places, other than the swordsmen near the sword catacomb in the kingdom of Shi, the swordsmen in the kingdom of Lian were also defeated. Those swordsmen who were further away from the sword catacomb were even more miserable. From this, it also showed what LV Ruochang, the sword cultivator, had said when setting up the plan that these ordinary battles could not eliminate the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall. This was because the life-saving talismans given by their sects were really powerful. An early-stage Golden Core cultivator who activated the talisman could fight against a third-grade illusory sword cultivator. Of course, if Ji Hong had wanted to escape at that time, she would have used the Yuanying hand to escape, and LV Ruochang would not have been able to do anything. The special thing was that the Yuanying hand talismans were like other talismans and could be used multiple times. Therefore, if the sword cultivators wanted to kill the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall outside the sword tomb, they would have to exhaust a lot of swordsmen and engage in many battles. This was what the sword cultivators, who were at a disadvantage in numbers, did not want to see. This also contributed to LV Ruochang setting up a sword array in the sword tomb and preparing to kill the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall. Chapter 2597. The Jindan cultivators in the discussion hall did not think as far as LV Ruochang. From the various signs, it was clear that the sword cultivators were truly defeated, and it was not a trap like some of the Jindan cultivators were worried about. As such, every single Jindan cultivator in the discussion hall gathered their strength and urged their disciples to chase after the sword cultivators. They wanted to end this battle with the sword cultivators in the sword tomb. In addition, after the surviving Jindan cultivators in the discussion hall heard about Qian Mo's self-destruction, they also felt a sense of sorrow in their hearts. Actually, Qian Mo, Yuan Zhongyu, and Ji Hong could have escaped that day. However, Qian Mo chose this path himself. It was a path of no return. How could they not sigh? These Jindan cultivators were all heavenly geniuses, and all of them had ambitions in their hearts. However, they were currently in a dangerous situation, and it was as though they were treading on thin ice. If they were not careful, they could lose their lives at any moment. Not to mention their ambitions, their dreams were all about to turn into smoke. As such, the words that Qian Mo said before his death were deeply acknowledged by them. The confusion, ridicule, and mockery towards Qian Mo had all disappeared, and a trace of faintly discernible respect was born in their hearts. That's right. Who could clearly differentiate whether a person was good or bad? How could a person be determined by a single word or sentence? The bad that Xiaohua thought was not bad. The good that the Sun thought was not good. The bad that Taoist Shuiyu thought was not bad. The good that everyone worshipped might not be good either. Perhaps there was no such thing as good or bad in a human. No one would be able to differentiate between good and bad. Speaking of which, The Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain, who was hiding in the Sword Tomb, did not know that the sword cultivators were defeated. As they approached the Sword Tomb, the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators also chased after them. Xiao Hua, who was hiding in the small house, naturally did not know either. He was currently like the tens of thousands of cultivators, wholeheartedly comprehending the so-called secret technique of the Yu family and researching how to combine this secret technique with the sword arts of the sword cultivators. However, the difference was that while the tens of thousands of cultivators were dreaming of turning stone into gold, Xiao Hua had already treated this dream as a golden millet. On this day, a male cultivator who was not very tall quietly entered the sword tomb. This male cultivator's face was flat, and his nose, mouth, and other things were stuck to his face. Moreover, his eyes were not a normal size, and there were several large tumors on his forehead. In particular, there were a few clumps of black hair growing on the tumor. It looked really indecent. This male cultivator was at the early stage of foundation establishment. His movements were vigorous, and he was also proficient in the art of flight. With a jade slip in his hand, he easily bypassed the formations and sword formations within the sword mound, arriving at the Zigui, where Xiao Hua had met Yuping that day. However, the male cultivator threw the jade slip into Zigui with great familiarity. The stone touch token flashed inside Zigui and disappeared like a meteor. The male cultivator let out a sigh of relief and looked around. There was a hint of worry on his face. Not long after, Yuping flew over with a smile on her face and said from afar, "Yu Dong, you're finally back. Greetings, sixth uncle." This early foundation establishment cultivator was actually Yu Dong. It's that Yu Dong who recommended Xiao Hua. Moreover, this Yu Dong was actually a rare stutterer among cultivators. Yuping was probably already used to Yu Dong's stuttering. Seeing that he had already finished bowing and hadn't finished his respectful words, Yuping nodded and said, "Get up. We haven't seen each other for several years. Your cultivation seems to have made some progress. It's at Nanping Mountain. There's some." At this point, he actually couldn't continue, as if something was stuck in his throat. "That's right, this is your opportunity." Yuping didn't pay attention and said with a smile, "The heavens are the fairest. Seeing that you're bitterly cultivating, they gave you an opportunity. You must properly grasp it." "Yes," Dong said this word very smoothly, as if he was already used to saying it. "Let's go." Yuping waved his hand and flew up, saying, "This Zigui is new and you're not familiar with it. Follow this old man back to Fanjin Palace and find a quiet room to cultivate. Don't disappoint the heavens." Yes, nephew understands." Hearing this, Yu Dong's heart was filled with gratitude, and he couldn't help but stutter again. Seeing the flush on Yu Dong's face and the joy in his eyes, Yuping's gaze was also kind and even a little bit tender. The corner of his mouth curled up into a smile, and he said while flying, "The day after tomorrow will be the last batch of cultivators to enter the palace for the Midas touch. These past few years, you haven't completed the sect master's task." This old man has also mentioned this to Senior Yu Bing several times. He also knows about your difficulties, so he didn't rush you, and even covered it up for you in front of the sect master. However, the recommendation of cultivators is an absolute order from the sect master. No matter who it is, they have to recommend a few foundation establishment cultivators. Yes, nephew is ashamed." Yu Dong's face flushed red, and his eyes flashed with panic. Sect master's punishment. Yuping naturally wouldn't wait for Yu Dong to finish speaking, and he smiled. "However, you were able to recommend an early foundation establishment cultivator at the most critical moment, and it seems that his aptitude is also very good. This old man has already told Senior Yu Bing that you've completed the sect master's task. When you return to Fanjin Palace, you must first pay a visit to Senior Yu Bing and thank him for his grace. Only then can you calm down." No. Yu Dong had already said no more than 10 times behind Yuping, but Yuping didn't care. He continued to fly as he spoke. Moreover, he was flying slightly faster. When Yudong used all his strength to fly behind Yu Ping, he grabbed Yu Ping's Taoist robe. Yudong couldn't say no. What's wrong? Yu Ping smiled. Although you've only recommended one person, but with your eloquence, it's really rare. This person is equivalent to 10 of them. No. Yudong was really anxious, and his face was almost covered in sweat, and the veins on his forehead were popping out. Seeing that Yu Ping was also at a loss, Yudong hurriedly took out a jade slip and immersed his spiritual sense in it, and quickly handed it to Yu Ping. Yu Ping frowned as he received it, and when he finished reading it, he was shocked. What? You didn't recommend a cultivator at all? Yes. Yudong was very familiar with this word. But if you didn't recommend him, then who recommended Feng Ying from the Huanhua sect? Yu Ping was a little flustered, and he asked anxiously. Yudong shook his head vigorously, indicating that he didn't know Feng Ying at all. But he used your stone striking token. It was your earliest stone striking token. Yu Ping still didn't give up, and said anxiously, among the disciples of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain, only you haven't returned for many years, and only you have the route of the stone striking token. Yudong didn't say much, and with a clap of his hands, he took out a jade slip and handed it to Yu Ping. Yu Ping's spiritual sense entered it, and his face was really ashen. This is your stone striking token. It's really the one you didn't use for a long time. But that day, senior brother Yu Ping, why did you say it was your stone striking token? Yu Ping was also stunned. The Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain knew that the blood sacrifice they had performed in the Sword Tomb was a matter that angered both men and gods. So how would they dare to let others know? In these few decades, 100,000 cultivators had died in the Sword Tomb for no reason, and it was more serious than the great battle of Dao cultivators. So how could it not attract the attention of others? However, among these 100,000 cultivators, most of them were cultivators below the Qi refinement stage, and the majority were itinerant cultivators. Therefore, although the great battle of Dao cultivators had attracted the attention of some forces after the battle began, everyone's attention was on the battle, and this matter was forgotten. However, if people really found out about the Yu family's plan, then Yu Ping also knew that this would be the beginning of the Yu family's destruction, even if Yu Qingtian didn't say so. Thinking of this, and looking at Yudong, who was so anxious that his forehead was sweating, Yu Ping was also trembling in mid-air. What should I do? Yu Ping's mind was in a fierce struggle. Needless to say, this was definitely a mistake made by Yu Ping. As for where the mistake was made, Yu Ping wasn't clear, and it was too late to find out what the mistake was. Yu Ping could naturally push this matter to Yu Ping. However, who was Yu Ping? He was Yu Ping's senior brother, who was very close to him. Yu Ping was able to mingle in the Yu family to this extent because of Yu Ping's care. If it was Yuhua's mistake, Yu Ping would have jumped up long ago, and there would be no need for him to think about it. However, Yu Ping couldn't do it, and Yu Ping couldn't expose it. Moreover, although it was Yu Ping's order to bring Xiao Hua into the Brahma Gold Palace, Yu Ping didn't carefully inspect Xiao Hua's token. Moreover, when he entered the palace, he even quarreled with the disciple who was inspecting him. Of course, even if Xiao Hua's token wasn't wrong, and even if Yu Ping didn't think that Xiao Hua didn't have the token of the Cleansing Flower sect, he was the one who brought Xiao Hua in, and no matter how he tried to clear himself of this responsibility, it was impossible. However, in just a short moment, Yu Ping calmed down, and a confident smile appeared on his face. 6666. Seeing Yu Ping's panic disappear, and a smile appeared on his face, Yudong was stunned, and he hurriedly pulled on Yu Ping's robe to ask. However, the more anxious he became, the more he stuttered, and he actually said 6 4 times in a row, but he was still unable to say uncle. Donger, don't be anxious. Yu Ping naturally knew what Yudong was thinking, and he patted Yudong's shoulder with a smile. This matter has nothing to do with you. It is this old man's negligence. No, this word was resolute, and Yudong took out a blank jade letter, wrote something on it, and passed it to Yu Ping. Ah! After Yu Ping saw it, a smile appeared on his face, and he said, "This child, what did you say about going to the sect head to admit your mistake?" You even want to ask for this old man's forgiveness. What's the point of bringing up such a matter? As long as you have such intentions, this old man will be satisfied, and this old man will not have taken care of you in vain. Chapter 2598. Immediately, Yu Ping pulled Yudong and said as they flew, "Actually, the situation is not as serious as you think. The Huanhua Sect Foundation establishment disciple called Feng Ying has been arranged by this old man to stay in the cultivation nest. You also know that the cultivation nest is the most important place in the Brahma Golden Palace. It is completely controlled by the sect leader's Silver Tiger. Without a cultivation level above the Golden Core stage and special abilities, it is impossible to escape from there." Yes, although Yudong stuttered. How could a foundation establishment cultivator be so stupid? Yuping only needed to point it out, and he understood. The panic on his face lessened, and he answered with a single word. "No matter what mission Feng Ying came here for, since he is here, he can forget about going back. In the past, our Brahma Golden Palace has had disciples from the Huanhua sect. Since they can recommend him, why can't we?" Yu Ping gritted his teeth and said, "Moreover, when Feng Ying entered the cultivation nest, the sect leader also knew. This old man said that he was recommended by you, and he did not say anything. You don't have to say anything now." "Yes." Yudong nodded. "You must be sure today that no matter who comes to ask you, this Feng Ying was recommended by you. As for how you met him and how you recommended him, only you know. If you want to say it, say it. If you don't want to say it, no one will force you. This old man can be sure that no one will ask." Yu Ping said, "Even if there's a mistake in the end, and the sect leader wants to take responsibility, you must insist that you were tricked by Feng Ying. He deliberately deceived you, and you also intended to fulfill the sect leader's orders. You hit it off. No one is wrong." "Yes." Yudong nodded. "Well, now that you have completed your mission, you still have to do as this old man said, and pay your respects to Marshal Uncle Yubing. If anything happens in the future, he will help you." Seeing that Yudong was very obedient, Yu Ping was relieved and smiled as he flew towards the Brahma Golden Palace. But after flying for a while, Yu Ping stretched out his hand and said, "Dong-er, give me your original stone mastery token." "Yes." Yudong reached out his hand and took out the stone tablet token that Yu Ping had just returned to him. Yu Ping took it and opened his mouth. A silver flying sword flew out and hit the jade talisman, shattering it into pieces. Then, with a twist of his hand, a silver-white light flashed, and the jade talisman turned into powder. Yu Ping waved his hand, and all the fragments floated into the air, landing on the sparse scarlet plants on the ground. With a few gusts of wind, they disappeared without a trace. "Let's go." Yu Ping finally felt relieved. He waved his hand and flew away. Yudong blinked his eyes and opened his mouth, but not a single word came out. He was still thinking about how he should answer if no one asked him about it, or how he should make this lie perfect. Just like what Yu Ping thought, no one asked Yudong. Even if there were dozens of Yu family disciples who met Yudong, they would only nod with a smile or leave without even looking at him. They knew that the only reply they would receive was a single word from Yudong. Seeing such a situation, while Yu Ping appeared calm on the surface, his anxious heart finally calmed down. Even a foundational cultivator who had done something wrong would feel uneasy in his heart. "Go. Senior Uncle Yubing is in his quiet room. Go and pay your respects." After walking to the plaza, Yu Ping pointed at another door and instructed Yudong. "Yes." Yudong did not say anything else, nodding his head and walking towards the door. Yu Ping hesitated for a moment before walking towards the room where Xiaohua was imprisoned. Looking at the room from afar, which was no different from the other rooms, a trace of ruthlessness flashed past Yu Ping's eyes. He did not even dare to approach it, glancing at it a few times before leaving. The pitiful Xiaohua was still paying attention to the door, waiting for someone to check on him before using his concealment technique. Or perhaps he could use his concealment talisman to escape without anyone noticing. Who would have thought that even if the other party discovered him, they would not disturb him at all, directly making him into a blood sacrifice? who was the one who thought he was smart enough to walk right into the trap. Yu Ping had only just turned into a passageway when a late-stage Foundation establishment old man hurriedly walked over. It was precisely that old man Yu Bing that Xiao Hua had seen at Wu Jiaziyi's place. "Io, senior brother Yu Bing." Yu Ping saw him from afar and hurriedly said, "Donger is back." The moment he entered the palace, he immediately went to pay his respects to Yu. "Did you see him?" It is rare for Dong to still remember this old man." Seeing that it was Yu Ping, Yu Bing nodded his head slightly. However, his footsteps did not stop as he said, "This old man saw him just now." However, this old man had an important matter to attend to and did not listen to him speak in detail. Seeing that his cultivation has made some progress, he did not waste the past few years of training outside. Yes, Yu Ping smiled apologetically. "This is all due to senior brother's care. If this old man does not take care of you all, who else can I take care of?" Yu Bing laughed. "You all are not old." At this point, a sharp tiger's roar could be heard in the air, resounding throughout the entire Brahma Gold Palace. "Enough. This old man will not talk to you anymore. Quickly return to the quiet room. The last time is about to begin. Let's see if you all have any opportunities." Yu Bing waved his hand, stopping Yu Ping from following him as he instructed. "I have already told Dong to hurry back to the quiet room. This child is really lucky to have returned today." Yes, this little brother understands." Yu Ping's heart trembled as he hurriedly stopped in his tracks. Looking at Yu Bing's back, he turned back to look at Xiao Hua's small room before turning to another place. In just a moment, there were still many disciples of the Yu family walking back and forth in the square, but now there was no one to be seen. Above the square, above the silver sky, Yu Qingtian had already stood up with a trace of excitement on his face. Holding the silver tiger-shaped magic tool in his hand, he looked at the two silver balls of light in front of him with bright eyes. At this time, the silver balls of light were already hundreds of feet in size. Above the two balls of light, one crimson and one azure, were boiling like boiling water. From time to time, the crimson and azure splendor would splash out from the balls of light, and countless tiny flames and tiny ice shards would fall from the sky. Even when the crimson brilliance collided with the azure brilliance, there were even rumbling sounds of explosions. Previously, there was only a part of the crimson and azure light, but now, more than half of the balls of light were filled by the crimson and azure light. The previous silver splendor was now more like a shell or a binding, completely restricting the crimson and azure light under the silver balls of light. As for the two azure and red crystal threads that were previously connected between the two balls of light, they were now as thick as a strand of hair, firmly holding the two balls of light together. The azure and red colors would overflow from time to time in the crystal threads. However, although the two crystal threads were entangled together like before, at this time they were not as simple as a thin thread, but were entangled together in an extremely complicated manner, as if they were connected into a string of sword talismans. The sword talismans flickered under the crimson and azure splendor, as if they were about to break free from the crystal threads. The entire space above the cloud curtain, which was several times larger than the square, was filled with the aura of extreme yang and extreme yin. The entire space became unstable. Naturally, Yu Qingtian could not get close to the two silver balls of light. He was pushed far away by the extreme yang and extreme yin, more than 500 feet away. Although Yu Qingtian was holding the silver tiger firmly in his hand, his eyes were still staring at the noisy azure light ball. This azure light had been growing from a sliver of the silver light to nearly half of it now. It had been more than 10 years, and he had watched the growth of the six directions in spirit bit by bit. At this critical moment, even with his cultivation of the beginner gold core stage, he could not help but feel his heart in his throat. Unexpectedly, the azure splendor had been boiling for more than 3 days, and the azure light had increased by more than 30%, but there was still no special movement on the ball of light. Yu Qingtian looked at the crimson ball of light next to him. Although the crimson color of the ball of light was slowly growing along with the crimson crystal threads on the two balls of light. It was not growing as fast as the azure light ball. Now, it had only grown by more than 10%. Yu Qingtian seemed to be deep in thought. The silver tiger in his hand swayed slightly, and a few faintly discernible rays of silver light fell from the surrounding space. Coincidentally, they covered the azure ball of light. For a moment, the silver light on the ball of light shone brightly, binding the azure splendor. Then, as if they were complementing each other, the crimson splendor intensified its agitation and accelerated its growth after another day. There was a clear sound like a thunderclap, and the two balls of light suddenly stagnated. All the crimson, azure, and silver light stopped abruptly, and even the splendor that had just splashed out strangely stopped in midair. Yu Qingtian frowned, and the silver tiger in his hand shook slightly again, as if it was about to move. Unfortunately, before he could activate his spiritual power, a buzzing sound like a tiger's roar was emitted from the two balls of light at the same time. The crimson and azure lights of the two balls of light moved strangely again. However, this time, they were not boiling, but were rotating in the silver balls of light. As they rotated, countless sword talismans appeared on the balls of light. After each sword talisman appeared, a ray of sword light rushed into the air, and the sword talismans sank into the balls of light. Of course, these sword talismans did not appear randomly, but appeared on the two balls of light at the same time. However, one was crimson, and the other was azure. With the appearance of these sword talismans, the crimson and azure lights gradually separated from the silver balls of light, and gradually sank into the silver balls of light. Seeing that the two balls of light had regained the bright silver color of decades ago, Yu Qingtian had a bad feeling in his heart. Chapter 2599. However, at this moment, the bright silver ball of light suddenly emitted extremely bright red and azure colors. Yu Qingtian involuntarily closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, he saw that the two bright silver balls had completely turned into red and azure colors. Woo-woo, the azure ball of light did not give Yu Qingtian any time to hesitate. With a strange sword hum, the ball of light emitted rays of brilliance, and the brilliance condensed into the beautiful figure of Zhang Yuhe in midair. Sec Master Yu, thank you for your help, Zhang Yuhe said indifferently. Now that my six directions Yin spirit is ready, and the six directions Yang spirit of your foundation establishment stage boy is also ready, we can carry out the last blood sacrifice. As long as the blood and souls of the last living creatures are sent into the sword spirits, these two sword spirits will have the initial spiritual intelligence. Then our cooperation will be successful. Then Zhang Yuhe, who was in the sword shadow, raised her head slightly, looked at the silver sky above her head, and said, "In addition, I can also help you attract the sword energy and sword intent of the sword catacomb, and help the disciples of the Yu family of fallen gold mountain turn stone into gold. Consider it a little sincerity from me." After saying that, the sword light flashed and scattered, like flying flowers scattering on the ground, fell into the ball of light, and disappeared. Yu Qingtian forced a smile on his face, but when he heard the last sentence, embarrassment appeared on his face, and even surprise appeared in his eyes. Yu Qingtian was stunned. The silver tiger in his hand moved, but did not send out any signal. Guji, there seemed to be a light bell-like sound, and a smiling Zhang Yuhe's beautiful face appeared on the azure ball of light. Sec Master Yu, why are you hesitating? If you feel that it is inappropriate, you can ask your little foundation establishment stage cultivator. I will cover my ears. Whoosh, similarly, dozens of red sword lights flew out of the red ball of light, and a faintly discernible figure of Yutong appeared. Sec Master, Yutong's somewhat helpless voice sounded. There is no need to hesitate at this time. Now that things have come to this, we have no choice but to release the arrow from the bow. Sec Master, you should carry out the last blood sacrifice. All right, be careful. A hint of bitterness appeared on Yu Qingtian's face. He looked at the azure brilliance and saw Zhang Yuha covering her ears with her hands. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger emitted a bright silver light. Tens of thousands of silver rays shot out from the silver tiger's mouth and rushed straight to Yu Qingtian's feet. They passed through the silver clouds and landed on a large area below him. The strange thing was that the places where these light beams landed were exactly the huts where Xiao Hua and the others were. Moreover, every light beam landed on a hut. Wong wong. A deafening sound was emitted from these rays of light. Along with this sound, the rays of light began to vibrate. Along with this vibration, more than 10,000 small houses separated from the Silver Palace. Unexpectedly, each small house became an independent small silver lattice. This lattice was very strange. It had edges and corners, and actually looked like a hexahedron. Following these tens of thousands of light particles, after these silver lattices separated, they did not fly up into the air. Instead, they slowly sank, and the entire square became a huge hole. Below the hole was not a soil layer, but a large area of silver brilliance. These tens of thousands of lattices slowly moved in this silver brilliance, like stars in the sky. They gradually formed a mysterious magic array, and then stopped. When all the lattices stopped moving, with a whoosh, all the silver light particles returned to Yu Qingtian's silver tiger. Yu Qingtian rested for a moment, then shook his hand again. The silver tiger emitted light particles from all over, and several silver rays as thick as a fist rushed down, aiming at the surroundings of the huge hole. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The silver rays landed on the doors around the hole, then turned into rainbows, becoming thumb-sized rainbows that hit the doors. The doors also began to shake violently. The rainbows swept past the rooms behind the doors, and the silver houses also slowly floated up. After a while, about 9 silver houses floated up from the huge hole, and the silver brilliance immediately covered these houses. However, the tens of thousands of lattices were at the bottom of the silver brilliance, and these 9 houses were above these lattices, surrounding them. After everything was done, Yu Qingtian sat down cross-legged, clapped his hands, and took out an elixir and put it into his mouth. Sect Master Yu, you should still improve your cultivation. Zhang Yuha jumped out, and a beautiful sword-like figure fluttered on the azure light ball. Why don't this sword lend you a hand in a while? In order to cooperate with you, this old man has racked my brains for decades. What did I have the time to cultivate in seclusion? Yu Qingtian snorted coldly, opened his eyes slightly, and said, "Instead of helping this old man, you ridiculed me. This old man is starting to doubt your sincerity in cooperating with me. Hee, isn't this sword just going to lend you a hand?" Zhang Yuha giggled. Obviously, she was very happy because the sword spirit was about to be formed. Yu Qingtian was stunned and immediately realized that he had misspoken, so he closed his eyes and ignored Zhang Yuha. Zhang Yuha's figure danced in the azure ball of light for a long while. Then, she suddenly transformed into an azure flying sword. Kung, a crisp sword cry rang out. She directly rushed towards the silver-white sky above the space. Following the emergence of the azure flying sword, a slightly smaller scarlet flying sword also flew out from the scarlet light ball. Similarly, a clang-clang sound was heard. The 2 flying swords rushed into the space, one in front and one behind, one in green and one in red. The scarlet flying sword rushed into the brilliance of the azure flying sword like a swallow returning to its nest. The 2 swords intertwined with each other, and with a resounding clang sound, they quickly pierced toward the silver-white sky. An incomparably sharp and invincible sword essence quickly overflowed in the entire space. This little girl's cultivation has improved a lot again. Yu Qingtian opened his eyes helplessly, as if he was already familiar with Zhang Yua's move. As he muttered to himself, he did not forget to take a look at the scarlet light ball. He saw that the sword runes on the light ball were similar to the azure light ball, but it did not have Zhang Yuha's arrogant figure. Go! Yu Qingtian shook his silver tiger, and a faint silver light was emitted from it. The silver light swayed slightly and vibrated with a strange fluctuation. The silver light did not chase after the green and red sword light. Instead, it shone in all directions, and the fluctuation fell below Yu Qingtian's body. The ripples had already landed on the silver canopy beneath Yu Qingtian, and it immediately began to vibrate. The vibrations quickly filled the entire space, and very soon they surpassed the flying sword and reached the canopy that the flying sword was about to stab. Almost without any sound, the sky suddenly split open like a pair of sharp scissors cutting through silk, revealing the clear night sky beyond the sky. At this moment, the stars were shining brightly in the night sky, and a crescent moon hung in the sky like a boat. The azure and red flying swords crossed the sky and rushed straight into the night sky. Not only did the dazzling sword light illuminate the entire night sky, but the clang of the sword also resounded throughout the 9 heavens. Woo! As soon as the azure and red flying swords appeared, all the broken swords within 100 miles responded. Countless mournful cries were heard from the sword tomb, as if they were crying and surrendering. A swordsman? Far away from the sword tomb, LV Ruochang and the other third-grade illusory swordsmen were fleeing toward the sword tomb in a panic. Suddenly, they saw a strong sword essence rushing out of the sword tomb and arousing their sword spirits. The sword origin in their bodies surged, and their flying swords also cried out, wanting to rush out of their bodies. They all turned pale with fright. Yes, how could they not turn pale with fright? According to their thinking, the hundreds of thousands of Dao Sect cultivators and dozens of Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall had been led by the nose to the sword tomb. If they appeared out of nowhere and transformed into swords, how could those Dao Sect cultivators fall into their trap? Wouldn't the appearance of the sword transformation master alert the enemy? Besides, the location of the sword transformation master was different from the direction of the sword formation that LV Ruochang had set up. Once LV Ruochang entered the sword tomb, would he go in the direction of the sword transformation master's sword essence? Or would he go in the direction of the sword formation? In an instant, LV Ruochang made a decision. She waved her hand and said, "Let's go. Let's fly to the place where the sword transformation master appeared. Otherwise, those Taoist sect practitioners will be able to tell that we haven't really lost. They will be able to discover our plan to lure the enemy." Yes, the surrounding swordsmen were also helpless. They passed the order to each other and hurriedly searched for a route, preparing to fly toward the Yu family in the falling Gold Mountain. But right at this moment, the sword transformation master's aura suddenly disappeared, as though it had never appeared. Sigh, LV Ruochang sighed. However, she knew that this was the real sword transformation master's sword essence. It was majestic and abnormally fresh. It was definitely not some broken sword essence from the sword tomb. Even if she couldn't lure all the Taoist sect practitioners into the sword formation that she had set up, she definitely couldn't blame this sword transformation master who appeared out of nowhere. Since LV Ruochang had sensed this sword transformation master's sword essence, the Jindan practitioners in the conference hall naturally sensed it as well. Gao Wei from the Seven Skills sect was the first to stop. He hurriedly sent a message to Lu Xinwu of the Splendid sect, reminding them that a sword transformation master with strength comparable to a nascent soul practitioner had appeared. Soon, the hundreds of thousands of practitioners stopped as LV Ruochang had expected. They pondered whether they should continue the pursuit or not. All kinds of communication talismans flew around in the air. Not long after, the Jindan practitioners in the conference hall gathered together again. Gao Wei, who was the first to discover this, didn't wait for the others to speak and shouted, "A sword transformation master actually appeared in the sword tomb. This can only mean one thing. This is the reinforcements of the Huan country's swordsmen. I suggest that we chase to this place and resolutely not to chase into the sword tomb." Chapter 2600. Hung Zhao did not answer. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked in the direction of the Brahma Golden Palace and the direction in which the sword cultivators had fled. He seemed to be deep in thought after everyone had discussed for a while. Hung Zhao asked, "What Cultivator Gao said makes sense. However, I would like to ask, if the sword cultivators had a hidden hand in the sword tomb, would the swordsman who transformed into a sword be exposed? Besides, can a swordsman who transformed into a sword participate in the battle now? Perhaps it is not a swordsman who transformed into a sword, but it must be a hidden hand of the sword cultivators." Gao Wei, of course, also realized this point and immediately cried out. However, according to what I know, the sword cultivators did not flee in the direction of the sword light. They fled in a different direction. De Sun said with a smile. It seems that they saw the sword light and changed their direction. Regardless of whether it is a hidden hand or not, the sword cultivators may have other hidden hands in the sword tomb other than our Taoist sect's array. I do not recommend advancing rashly. Lu Xinwu said. Actually, according to the sword cultivators' final change of direction, the sword light should not be a hidden hand. Hung Zhao said with a smile. It is very likely that it is a swordsman who transformed into a sword. These sword cultivators are grasping at the last straw and want to transform into a sword to save them. Yes, that's right. Other than Gao Wei and Lu Xinwu, 80% of the remaining cultivators agreed with Hung Zhao. After all, they had seen the sword cultivators suddenly change direction. Do we have to face the swordsman directly? Zhu Jun of the Cool Breeze Valley, who had just recovered from his serious injuries, said in a low voice. So what if we face the swordsman? Can they make a move? Li Jijia of the Changbai sect said proudly. I would like to see the swordsman kill both of us. Haha, even if he transformed into a sword, he will not attack. Those sword cultivators have really lost. They are panicking, De Sun said with a smile. Actually, there's one more thing. Hung Zhao continued. This sword tomb is truly huge. Although my Dao sect's 10-direction annihilation formation covers over 50 kilometers, it is still insignificant within this sword tomb. This is something that we did not consider when we were discussing setting up a large formation to ambush sword cultivators within the sword tomb. We are chasing after the sword cultivators, but how can we lure them into the large array? I was just discussing this matter with senior brother to son. The direction that the sword cultivator fled in is completely different from the location of the great array. We can either stop chasing him or chase him in the direction of the great array. However, before the two of us could come to a conclusion, the sword light appeared. Although it wasn't in the direction of the formation, it wasn't far from it. Everyone, do you think that the heavens are helping my Dao sect? Aha! Or is it fellow Taoist Xiong's generosity in the sword tomb? Yuan Zhongyu of the Kunlun sect laughed. Anyway, the sword cultivator is heading towards the 10-direction annihilation formation that my Dao sect has set up a long time ago. Do you think we should chase after him or not? Hung Li asked loudly. Many gold core stage cultivators had a little discussion. Under the situation where most of the cultivators agreed, they passed down the order of the conference hall, and hundreds of thousands of cultivators continued to chase into the sword tomb. LV Ruochang and the other swordsmen were even more delighted when they saw the cultivators chasing after them. However, in order not to arouse the suspicion of the cultivators, they still headed in the direction of the Brahma Gold Palace. When the time was right, they would turn in the direction of their own great array, the green and red sword light that had changed the entire situation of the battle between the Dao cultivators paused in midair for a moment before suddenly descending and landing on the two balls of light. However, things did not end with the fall of the two sword lights. The incomplete sword essence within 100 miles of the sword light flashed with all kinds of sword lights and flew toward the two balls of light. Even the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the sword tomb rushed over with the sword light with its unique tyranny, setting off countless hurricanes within 100 miles. The hurricane's target was the Brahma Gold Great Array. Yu Qingtian, who had already opened the sky canopy of the Brahma Gold Great Array, could no longer close his eyes and meditate at this time. He activated his magic power and cast a spell. The silver tiger turned into a tiger about a foot long and flew into the sky. It opened its mouth, and thousands of silver threads rushed into the sky canopy, covering the entire area where the great array had been torn apart just now. Woo-woo! Countless sword lights surged, and sword chi surged. The incomplete flying sword carried the incomplete sword essence and rushed into the silver light canopy above the great array. The light canopy was pressed into a concave shape, but with the support of the silver tiger, it was still stable. At this time, the true face of the Brahma Gold Great Array was revealed. The array was an oval-shaped silver space that was filled with a silver brilliance. At the top of this space was the silver tiger, the magic weapon that controlled the Great Array. In the center of the Great Array were the two balls of light of the Great Yin-Yang Six Directions Sword Spirit. They were slightly lower than the other balls of light. They were 9 silver areas, which were the rooms where the disciples of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain cultivated. At the bottom of the Great Array, there was a very mysterious place. It was the grid where Xiao Hua and the others were going to be blood sacrificed. These grids were operating strangely in the silver light. Yu Qingtian's figure flew in the air, parallel to the two balls of light. He pointed his finger, and with a quick sound, the concave light curtain flickered slightly, and a huge amount of sword energy and metal elemental spiritual energy of heaven and earth, mixed with some of the flying swords and sword intent, rushed into the formation. The sword chi and gold type spiritual energy of heaven and earth did not stop at all, and directly rushed into the 9 silver areas and the blood sacrifice grid. On the contrary, the two balls of light did not leave a trace. This was because the flying swords and sword essence rushed directly into the two balls of light. However, the flying swords and sword essence did not cause any ripples when they fell into the balls of light. In the blink of an eye, even more fragments of sword essence flew out from the balls of light. As soon as these fragments of sword essence came out, the balls of light absorbed the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth and rushed to the 9 areas surrounding the balls of light and Yu Qingtian's body with fierce sword chi. There were also some fragments that gradually fell into the blood sacrifice grid. However, after passing through the two balls of light, the sword essence fragments were no longer as violent as before. There was only abundant sword chi produced by absorbing the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Swish, swish, swish in the 9 silver areas, colorful lights flashed, and the fragments of the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword essence were absorbed at the same time. The silver light that covered the thousands of grids slowly produced a kind of fluctuation. All the grids gradually trembled, and from the thousands of grids, there were thousands of small suction forces. These suction forces were extremely powerful, and they also drew in the fragments of the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword essence. However, as soon as these suction forces appeared, another kind of mysterious fluctuation was immediately produced in this area. It slowly passed through the silver light and rushed into the two balls of light in the center. This fluctuation went through the balls of light again, and the rhythm of the fluctuation had already changed slightly. Naturally, Xiaohua was also in one of the grids. He sat quietly and couldn't perceive the changes in the entire grid. From the original square sinking and moving in the silver light, he didn't feel anything at all. After comprehending the secret technique from the Jade Slip of Falling Gold Mountain and the ordinary sword cultivator's sword slip, he took out the incomplete sword transformation sword technique that he obtained from the secret auction in Sky Patrol City. Finally, he dug out the memories of Qingjian that little white dragon gave him. Now, Xiao Hua's cultivation was already at the peak of the late stage of foundation establishment. Although he didn't know if he had reached the peak of foundation establishment, he could step into the gold core stage at any time. His strength was at least comparable to a cultivator at the late stage of gold core stage. How could he be interested in a simple sword cultivation technique? Besides, he already had the flying sword technique of sword plays the world. Now, he also had the real sword cultivation technique of 9 stars illuminating the sun. He also had a higher level of attainment in sword cultivation. His vision was even higher. After looking at the secret technique for so long, he had some gains in his heart. He had already set his goal of comprehension on the primordial spirit sword controlling technique and the sword heart, planting the sword intent into the sword spirit and letting one's soul combine with the sword spirit. Only then can one become one with the flying sword. The sword heart is the heart of the flying sword. This heart is the soul of the person who transformed into the sword, and the flying sword is the body of the sword. Isn't this the same as the cultivation goal of a weapon cultivator? Xiao Hua instantly thought of Ji Yi, who had integrated the seal of overturning the sea. It's no wonder that the Dao sect treats sword cultivators as abnormal. Dao sect cultivators nourish their true qi and use it to condense a core in the Dantian. They also use the core to nourish their qi and communicate with the yin and yang of heaven and earth. They nurture a baby in the golden core. When the baby is born, they nourish it with the qi of heaven and earth and strengthen it. When the baby grows up, the baby and the physical body, Xiao Hua thought happily, as if he could feel the superiority of the Dao sect. However, when he thought of the realms after the nascent soul stage, although he still didn't have the true spirit severing technique, he suddenly woke up and cold sweat seeped out of his body. Damn it, that's not right. If that's the case, then in the end, the nascent soul, isn't it the same thing as the sword heart? He had already faintly sensed this idea when he was meditating after the secret auction. However, he didn't think too much about it. Now that he had obtained more secret techniques and comprehended more, he thought about it again and felt a lot of emotions. That is to say, no matter what sword cultivator, weapon cultivator, beast cultivator, or Dao sect cultivator, in the end, they will all return to the same place. Xiao Hua sighed. Then what about the Buddhist sect? It seems there's a difference. I can't see it now. What about Confucian cultivators? What about soul cultivators? Devil cultivators? There is no such thing as an infant in a devil cultivator. They only cultivate devil fire and devil blood. I'm afraid only Zhang Qingxiao herself knows what level she will reach in the end. It had to be said that this was the shortcoming of Xiao Hua's dabbling in too many things. When he had a little enlightenment in one direction, he would immediately have some ideas in other directions. Whether these ideas were right or wrong, and whether they could help his cultivation, he himself didn't know. Chapter 26:01. Of course, on the other hand, if Xiao Hua could comprehend all of his cultivation techniques by analogy, it would be extremely beneficial to his cultivation. Let's not talk about anything else. Take flying swords as an example. Xiao Hua himself understood the art of swords playing the world, and he himself knew the art of transforming flying swords. After coming into contact with the sword arts of sword cultivators, his flying swords cultivation improved by leaps and bounds. It was simply not something that ordinary swordsmen could hope to catch up to. Just when Xiao Hua had some comprehension, he suddenly felt that there were some changes in the small house. It actually started to tremble slightly, and an indescribable fluctuation spread throughout the small house. Xiao Hua used his divine sense to investigate and immediately understood. Isn't this the fluctuation mentioned in the secret technique? Could it be this so-called Midas touch is real? In order to expand their influence and even establish a sect, this Fallen Gold Mountains Yu family spent a lot of money. And if that's really the case, then this young master has indeed wronged the Yu family and even the Fallen Gold Mountains Yu family. Xiao Hua was someone who knew when to correct his mistakes. He was rather lucky that when he entered the small house, he did not suddenly disappear or make a move to create some trouble for this Midas touch. If this young master is able to benefit from this, I'm afraid that I will really help them in the future. However, is there really a foundation establishment pill in this world that would appear out of nowhere. However, Xiaohua immediately laughed in his heart. Since this place cannot confine this young master, it won't be difficult for this young master to escape from here. Let's just wait and see how it disintegrates. Thinking about this, Xiaohua activated the secret technique in the jade slip. A suction force that was neither large nor small rushed out from his body and was transmitted into the fluctuation. Through this fluctuation, a suction force was produced from the small box and rushed up to the space above. Shua, a dense metal attribute spiritual energy passed through the small house and filled Xiaohua's surroundings. And Xiaohua secretly nodded his head and activated the secret technique. The metal attribute spiritual energy was indeed drawn into his body. However, when he reached this point, Xiaohua stopped and thought to himself, if it was someone else with this kind of breathing and drawing spiritual energy into their body, their cultivation would definitely be impressive. However, what benefits does this kind of thin stream of metal attribute spiritual energy have to me? This young master only needs to activate the celestial body bestowment technique, and the metal attribute spiritual energy in the house will probably all be sucked into my body. Forget it, Xiaohua said with a smile. Let's use this secret technique to see if there is any special shady business. Thinking this, Xiaohua once again stimulated his cultivation method. The heaven and earth spiritual energy entered his body and was gradually tempered by Xiaohua's cultivation method. Sure enough, a faint trace of true essence was slowly born. This true essence was not as tyrannical as Xiaohua had imagined. It was similar to the true essence refined from ordinary heaven and earth spiritual energy. Oh, this Midas is Midas long as the secret technique. The Midas heavenly spiritual energy, it would have been tyrannical nature spiritual energy. Most of the metal was the tyrannical nature was. There was tyrannical nature was tyrannical and was not great to the sword cultivators to the sword and sword to cultivate to the cultivators to be. However, for the U family of Falling Gold Mountain to be able to establish such a large scale and do shady business of turning stone into gold, it was not out of Xiaohua's expectations that this secret technique would be able to turn the tyrannical nature of the metal attribute spiritual energy back into ordinary metal attribute spiritual energy. Who would have thought that the moment Xiaohua's smile appeared, it would freeze again? Along with the influx of the gold-attributed spiritual energy of heaven and earth, some fragmented sword intent mixed with the sword energy formed from the gold-attributed spiritual energy of heaven and earth also swarmed into the small room. Once Xiaohua's skin came in contact with the sharp sword energy and the rather familiar sword intent, an extremely cold feeling emerged from his skin and directly entered the bottom of his heart. This coldness was like a bolt of lightning flashing through his mind. No, that's not right. This secret technique is far more than this. The smile on Xiaohua's face was instantly shattered and was replaced with shock, or even surprise. However, he didn't have time to think too much about it. He hurriedly urged the secret technique to absorb the bits of shattered sword intent and sword chi into his body and began to refine them with the secret technique. However, just as he was about to transform the sword chi into true essence with great difficulty, Xiaohua had another thought. He changed the last part of the secret technique that was used to transform true essence to the sword technique used by sword cultivators to condense sword origin. Indeed, it was extremely difficult to convert sword chi into true essence. However, not only was it easy to convert sword chi into true essence, the amount of sword chi was also many times more than true essence. Xiaohua stored the strand of sword chi into his body and unknowingly clenched one hand into a fist and the other hand into a palm. His face revealed a look of ecstasy. Fuck. The Yu family of Falling Gold Mountain is definitely not an ordinary cultivation family. What a strange secret technique. How is it possible for an ordinary cultivation family to possess such a technique? Xiaohua almost cried out in shock. This sword intent, is a swordsman's understanding of the flying sword. It is the soul of the flying sword in a swordsman's heart. When a swordsman refines his sword intent, he will also gradually condense his soul into the sword intent. In this sword tomb, there are countless sword intents, whether they are nurturing swords, shining swords, or illusory swords. All of these sword intents are damaged and deeply engraved with the soul of the deceased swordsman. These sword intents cannot be used by a swordsman normally, but this falling Gold Mountains U family is actually able to shatter these sword intents and erase the imprint of the soul, leaving behind only the pure sword intent. To a swordsman, the sword intent and sword spirit are more or less fused together. Furthermore, this sword intent has a sword spirit, and it is unavoidable that the spiritual energy of heaven and earth can be condensed into sword chi. And this sword chi, through this secret technique, can be converted into sword origin, especially the sword chi with the fragmented sword intent. It is just like refining a pill. If a cultivator wants to take this pill, they can only absorb a small portion. But what about a swordsman? They should be able to absorb all of it. This young master has always been unable to form sword intent because I do not have sword origin. Now, there is a ready-made opportunity. Others want to convert it into true essence, but this young master does not need it and directly absorbs it to form sword origin. This is really dog shit luck. Thinking about this, Xiao Hua's mind became active again, and he could not help but deviate again. But why don't those sword cultivators of the Huan country have this kind of secret technique? Also, that little dear sword intent of Taoist bright sword. Forget it, what's the point of thinking so much? Xiao Hua hurriedly suppressed his curiosity and activated the secret technique to begin drawing in the sword chi and fragmented sword intent. Of course, after a short moment, Xiao Hua slapped his forehead again and activated the immortal body bestowment technique. An extremely powerful suction force was born from his body. Whatever the metal attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth, whatever fragmented sword intent, whatever sword chi, whatever they were all sucked into his body like a taodai opening its mouth. Then, he activated the secret technique, and the speed at which sword origin was produced increased by a lot. When Xiao Hua activated the immortal body bestowment technique, the suction force of the small grid naturally increased by a lot, and even more sword intent fragments and sword chi were snatched over. However, this suction force was still not enough compared to the overall suction force of the small grid. It did not cause any abnormalities at all, and it was impossible to be noticed by Yu Qingtian or Zhang Yuhe. The sword chi and sword intent in the sword catacomb seemed to be endless. Zhang Yuhe's sword spirit had been withdrawn for a long time, but the sword chi and sword intent that were pouring in did not stop. However, the layer of silver grid that Yu Qingtian's silver tiger had scattered in the sky could not support it. Moreover, such a big movement in the sword catacomb could easily attract the attention of others. Yu Qingtian grabbed with his hand, and several silver brilliants flashed on his right hand. The silver tiger roared and rushed to the sky. The brilliance around its body shone brightly, and a shadow of a silver tiger appeared. It slowly flew to the grid and blocked the flying swords and other objects that were rushing in. When it was level with the grid, the shadow turned into a ray of brilliance and merged into the grid. Immediately, the flaw of the large formation was repaired. Huh. Zhang Yue's smile flashed on the azure light ball again. Lord Yu, it's only been a few hours. The vital essence that you've absorbed is not enough to raise your cultivation level, right? Why did you turn off the large formation so early? Hee, this is not the usual time. Yu Qingtian did not care about Zhang Yuhe's ridicule. The battle between Taoist cultivators is here. Swordsmen and city guards of Sky Patrol City often pass by the edge of the sword catacomb. It's best not to make any noise. With that, Yu Qingtian stretched out his hand, and the silver tiger fell into his hand. Silver light flashed all over his body, and a large number of light beams were emitted from the silver tiger, hitting various parts of the sky. The silver light above the large formation flashed violently at first, and then it began to rotate. After the time it took to smoke a cigarette, it finally stopped. Zhang Yuha's face was solemn as she hovered above the azure light. She knew that the Buddhist golden array controlled by Silver Tiger was constantly changing. Even if a swordsman were to pass by, he would not be able to find any trace of the array. It was just a Xiaohua thought. How could a cultivation family, with such a wonderful secret technique, not have a wonderful concealment formation? However, the seriousness only flashed across Zhang Yuha's face for a moment, and was immediately replaced by a sneer. Zhang Yuha's beautiful figure also disappeared from the azure light ball. It seemed that Yu Qingtian had consumed a lot of his magic power to conceal the large formation again. After Yu Qingtian swallowed an elixir, he said gently, "Little friend Zhang, now that everything is ready, can we start the last blood sacrifice?" "I've been ready for a long time. You'd better ask your foundation establishment boy first." Zhang Yuha did not show her face, but only sent her voice out. Yu Qingtian looked at the crimson ball of light again. The ball of light was similar to the azure brilliance, and many sword talismans appeared on it. The sword talismans were stacked on top of each other, and no one knew how many layers and sword talismans there were. "Yu Tong, are you ready?" Yu Qingtian's figure floated in front of the red light ball. Sword light flashed on the light ball, and a faint figure appeared. Yu Tong seemed to be weak, but he seemed to be supporting himself. He said, "Granduncle, the boy can barely control the sword spirit, so he should be able to withstand a blood sacrifice. If this blood sacrifice succeeds, the boy's cultivation will definitely reach the peak of the late foundation establishment stage, and he will be able to control the sword spirit." Chapter 26:02. All right, since that's the case, let's not delay any further. Yu Qingtian nodded slightly. The Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain has been preparing for decades. Today, we'll do it in one go. "Yes, boy, I'll follow your arrangements." Yu Tong's figure slowly disappeared. It was far less elegant than Zhang Yuha's disappearance. Yu Qingtian watched as Yu Tong's figure disappeared, and a hint of hesitation appeared on his face. However, after a moment, he turned around again and took a few steps forward solemnly. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger landed in front of him. The silver tiger was like a real white tiger. It shook its head and wagged its tail in midair. Even the scattered light on its body shook in the wind like a tiger's fur. Yu Qingtian took a deep breath and slapped his hand on his chest. He opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood essence. The blood essence fell in midair and was about to turn into droplets. Yu Qingtian grabbed with his hand, and the blood essence condensed into a ball and stopped. Yu Qingtian then chanted a strange incantation. The same obscure incantation slowly appeared on his hands. As a faint silver light fell on the blood essence, the blood essence gradually became smaller, and its color gradually deepened. After 10 minutes, the blood essence was almost invisible, but its color was almost pitch black. "Go!" Yu Qingtian raised his hands with difficulty, as if he was holding up a mountain. The pitch black dot slowly rose from its original place. As Yu Qingtian moved his hand, it hit the silver tiger's forehead. With a soft bang, a black-red mark appeared on the silver tiger's forehead. It was long and flat like a third eye. The silver tiger also instantly lost its vitality and stopped in midair in a daze. Yu Qingtian's face was a little pale, and there was even a drop of sweat on his temples. However, Yu Qingtian did not have time to wipe it off. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger landed in front of him. Yu Qingtian reached out, and his hand slowly went into the mark on the silver tiger's forehead. Strangely, the mark was only the size of a thumb, but Yu Qingtian's hand went in very easily. When Yu Qingtian took out his hand, a fist-sized blood-red crystal appeared in his hand. This crystal was emitting a blood-red brilliance. It was extremely bewitching. There were countless folds on it, and when the silver light shone on it, it reflected countless rays of brilliance. However, all of these silver rays of light had turned blood red. Yu Qingtian only glanced at the blood-red crystal for a moment before he felt an extremely heart-piercing bewitchment coming from it. He had an impulse to rush into it. He didn't dare to look at it again and hurriedly moved his eyes away. He loosened his grip, and the blood-red crystal flew into the air. As soon as Yu Qingtian loosened his grip, a blood-red curtain of light automatically flew out from the crystal. In an instant, it sprinkled over the entire space. Not only did it force the silver brilliance to the edge of the magic circle, but also fell on the lowest level of the magic circle, where the thousands of small squares were located. However, at this time, the blood-red brilliance only covered the entire area. Under the light screen, the small grid was suffused with a strange blood-red color. Young friend Zhang, Yutong, this old man is going to start. Yu Qingtian turned his head slightly, looked at the two balls of light not far away, and reminded them. Yes, the boy is ready. Yutong's voice rang out. A moment later, Zhang Yue's voice also rang out. Sect Master Yu, this is the last blood sacrifice, and also the most important one. You and I have worked together very happily for the past few decades. I do not wish for any mishaps to occur at the final juncture. This old man understands. Yu Qingtian replied faintly. Young friend Zhang, how would you know about the effort this old man has put in? This old man hopes that nothing will go wrong on your side. Ha! Zhang Yuhe chuckled again. Yu Qingtian ignored her and stretched out his hand. An extremely strange spell was formed in his hand, and with a flip of his hand, he hit his chest. Puff! A mouthful of blood essence with a silver brilliance spurted out, and Yu Qingtian's face instantly turned abnormally pale. Go! Yu Qingtian bit his lips slightly and grabbed with his hand. The ball of blood essence turned into a bloody shadow that was very similar to a tiger's and rushed toward the blood-red crystal. Buzz! The moment the blood essence touched the blood-red crystal, it immediately seeped in. A blood-red brilliance that was 100 times more intense than before bloomed on the crystal. The brilliance didn't spread far and only lingered a few inches to the left of the crystal. The countless facets of the crystal gave birth to countless brilliances, and it swayed in and out like a blood-red stamen. Yu Qingtian chanted a strange spell again, and a faint layer of blood red mixed with black gas was produced from his glabella, slowly covering his entire face. After waiting for the time it took to drink a cup of tea, drops of silver light appeared on Yu Qingtian's hand. There was a layer of blood-red spots on the silver light. Yu Qingtian carefully touched the blood-red stamen with his hand, and it was extremely gentle. Pa! The silver light dripped onto the stamen. Buzz! The entire blood-red space vibrated, and endless fluctuations rippled from the stamen. The stamen also suddenly opened. Shwa! As the stamen bloomed, another blood-red crystal was revealed. The stamen was like a flying dandelion, turning into thousands of blood threads that fell on the thousands of small squares. It was through the red light that the thousands of small squares were stuck one by one. Xiaohua, who was in the small squares, naturally didn't know that the blood sacrifice had begun. He was proudly activating the immortal body bestowment technique and the secret technique of the Yu family to refine the sword energy. However, the moment Yu Qingtian closed the Buddhist gold formation, the sword essence and sword chi that were pouring in stopped. Xiaohua was quite stunned. However, the jade slip also stated clearly that there were other fluctuations behind it, which meant that there were still other secret techniques cooperating with it. However, after the secret technique was condensed into true origin energy, Xiaohua only took a rough look at it before abandoning it. After all, he could use the sword technique of a sword cultivator. So who would use this useless thing? Now that the sword chi had stopped, it didn't take long for the fluctuations mentioned in the jade slip to appear again. Xiaohua thought for a moment, then followed the instructions of the secret technique and activated his inexplicable cultivation method. He wanted to see if there were any other surprises waiting for him. Sure enough, the Yu family of the fallen gold mountain gave Xiao Hua a great surprise. Just as Xiao Hua activated this cultivation method, a burst of qi and blood surged up. The true origin that he had refined earlier suddenly changed and rapidly rushed into his blood vessels. What is this? Xiao Hua was puzzled. Could it be that he wants to intensify the true bloodline? Feeling the blood vessels in his body begin to boil, and it was indeed somewhat similar to the awakening of Cui Hongshan's true bloodline. Xiao Hua didn't think much about it, and only smiled bitterly to himself. This young master doesn't have a true bloodline. However, at this moment, high in the sky where the blood sacrifice was taking place, Yu Qingtian opened his hand and covered the blood-red crystal. He opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of silver blood essence. The blood-red and black mist covering Yu Qingtian's face also fell into the crystal along with the blood essence. Yu Qingtian seemed to have grabbed a heavy object, and with just a slight lift on the blood-red crystal, the crystal immediately began to emit blood-red smoke. Seeing the smoke rising, Yu Qingtian was relieved. He sat down next to the crystal, took out a medicinal pill, and sent it into the air. Then, he closed his eyes slightly. Obviously, even a gold core cultivator like him couldn't bear the consumption of energy in that short moment. The blood-red crystal, along with the appearance of the smoke, began to tremble. The smoke also turned into thousands of thin strands and rushed into the thousands of blood sacrifice grids along with the blood-red light. Xiao Hua, who was in the grids, suddenly felt a suction force pass through the hut and cover him. Under this suction force, the boiling blood vessels were about to rush out of his body. This is bad. At this point, even if Xiao Hua didn't want to judge a gentleman with the yardstick of a villain, he couldn't help but be vigilant. He hurriedly stopped the secret technique and wanted to use his cultivation method to stop the qi and blood that was gushing out. As the golden light around Xiao Hua's body flashed, the light protecting his body resisted the suction force, and the qi and blood that were about to seep out of his body also gradually fell back. This won't do. Who knows what kind of shady business this Yu family is up to? I'd better get out of here quickly. Xiao Hua made a prompt decision. He took out the spiritual talisman again and urged his magical power to hit the wall like before. However, contrary to Xiao Hua's expectations, when a spiritual talisman landed on the wall emitted a blood-red light, and the jade talisman was bounced back. The spiritual talisman seemed to be unable to penetrate the wall. This is bad. Xiao Hua's heart trembled, and he thought to himself, this is bad. Then, he took out another jade talisman, but it still couldn't penetrate the wall. Damn it, this young master has been hunting wild geese all my life, but now my eyes have been pecked by a wild goose. Xiao Hua smiled bitterly. This young master was only thinking about how to find out the dirty tricks of the Yu family. But I didn't expect to fall into the Yu family's trap. This hut is so strange. What kind of good thing can happen? This young master got a small advantage, but actually suffered such a big loss. This wall is turning blood red at this time. There must be some unforeseen event. Right at this moment, the suction force that was blocked by Xiao Hua's protective golden light suddenly increased, and the blood-red light emitted from the wall once again, gradually filling up the entire hut. Without any hesitation, Xiao Hua threw the jade talisman in his hand into the air. In a few breaths of time, the rabbit formation was laid out, and the suction force was negated by a little. However, Xiao Hua could already sense that the rabbit formation was not able to completely block the suction force, and the strange suction force was still sucking in the blood of Xiao Hua's body through the formation. I'm afraid that they have other plans. Xiao Hua hurriedly thought of another method, but in the blink of an eye, the suction force increased once again, as though it was stronger than before. At this moment, the suction force was so strong that it exceeded Xiao Hua's expectations, and he was a little flustered. The techniques of the Dao sect were all used to stabilize one's inner yuan and defend one's magical power. Very few of them were effective against attacking one's blood meridians. Apart from breaking the hut and escaping from this blood sacrifice formation, Xiaohua did not have any other good methods. Chapter 26:03. In a moment of desperation, Xiaohua came to a realization. He was definitely not the only cultivator who had fallen into the trap of the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain. This small hut was definitely not the focus of the Yu family's attack. In other words, even if he left the small hut, the outside of the small hut was where the suction force was. If he couldn't find a way to deal with the suction force and escape from the area of the blood sacrifice, he would still end up in the same situation as he was in the small hut. The suction force grew stronger and stronger. Xiaohua could almost feel his qi and blood seeping out of his blood vessels and slowly flying out of his physical body. He also felt as though he was floating in the air. However, this was just a feeling. It was as though his blood vessels were bound by something and couldn't completely seep out. Or perhaps the suction force was still too weak? However, Xiaohua didn't have time to think too much about it. The suction force increased once again. Even the blood threads that had just entered the small house suddenly descended from the sky and covered his head. Within the blood threads, there was actually something similar to a soul thread that directly penetrated his scalp and approached the location of his soul in the mysterious dark cloud. Soul? Blood sacrifice? If it was just his qi and blood surging out, Xiaohua might not have thought of blood sacrifice. However, how could Xiaohua not think of something similar to a soul thread directly facing his soul? Damn the Yu family of Fallen Gold Mountain. They actually dared to carry out a blood sacrifice here. They really deserve to die. Damn, damn. A trace of fierceness flashed in Xiaohua's eyes. He actually shouted damn 4 times in a row. It was obvious that he hated this blood sacrifice to the extreme. Since he knew that it was a blood sacrifice, Xiaohua slapped his forehead and the soul thread stretched out like a tentacle. The soul thread's fluctuation was already so strong that it easily swept away the blood threads that were similar to soul threads. Xiaohua even released his soul thread again and surrounded him. Waves of strong fluctuations were emitted and blocked the strong suction force. Yu Qingtian spat out a mouthful of blood essence on the blood-colored crystal. Countless wisps of smoke were produced and turned into thousands of thin wisps that rushed into the thousands of blood sacrifice grids along with the blood light. In the blink of an eye, thousands of drops of blood essence were sucked out from the thousands of small cells. Hysterical howls could be heard from the drops of blood essence. Fresh souls were struggling and roaring, trying to break free from the drops of blood essence and escape from the bloody light. Unfortunately, the suction force of the blood-red light was so great that even Xiaohua was almost unable to resist it. Most of these cultivators were aura-refining cultivators, so they simply didn't have any means to resist it. They followed the blood-red light and rushed into the vicinity of the blood-red crystal. Shua! At this moment, sword runes began to circulate above the azure ball of light. Countless flying swords rushed out of the ball of light and surrounded the azure ball of light. Go! Zhang Yue's crisp and cold command was heard, and all the sword lights immediately pierced towards the blood-red crystal. Little brat Yu Tong, if you're not coming to help this sword, what are you waiting for? Following Zhang Yue's command, hundreds of sword lights also flew out from the scarlet ball of light and pierced towards the blood-red crystal. When the red and azure sword lights pierced about a foot away from the crystal, the blood-red brilliance on the crystal flourished, and the sound of buzzing also became louder. A ball of blood-red light covered the crystal, blocking the sword lights 1 foot away. Close! Zhang Yuhe gave an order, and the azure and red sword lights rapidly circulated outside the blood-red light shield, covering it. Of course, the blood-red brilliance could also penetrate through the sword lights. The azure and scarlet sword lights cooperated very well. Obviously, this was definitely not the first blood sacrifice. Collect, at this moment, the thousands or even tens of thousands of living souls had already flown close to the crystal with their essence and blood. Following Zhang Yuha's soft command, the azure and crimson sword radiance separated into wisps of sword radiance and pierced into these living souls. The living souls let out extremely unpleasant screams and were absorbed by the two balls of light along with the sword radiance. Not long after, the two balls of light were covered by a layer of blood red. This layer of blood red gradually merged with the balls of light, and the sword talisman that was almost solidified on top of the light also turned into a bright red color. Scandium! Scandium! Two consecutive sword cries sounded, and the azure Zhang Yuha, wearing a blood-red sword outfit, flew out from the azure ball of light. The incomparably sharp feeling came from her body, as if she was originally a flying sword. This Zhang Yua's expression was somewhat sluggish, and her eyes were almost unblinking. However, those eyes were filled with greed as they looked at the thousands of souls that flew out along with the blood threads not far away. Shwa! Like a flash of sword light, Zhang Yuha's figure disappeared from the ball of light, and the next time she appeared, she was right in front of the blood-red crystal. Zhang Yuha opened her mouth, and hundreds of sword lights that were thinner than a strand of hair shot out from her mouth, and each of them pierced a soul. The souls struggled and howled as they were swallowed into Zhang Yuha's stomach. At the same time, a crimson Yutong wearing a Taoist robe also flew out from the ball of light. However, this Yutong was much shorter, and even its appearance was somewhat thin. Of course, this Yutong's expression was also sluggish. At the same time Zhang Yuha swallowed the souls, the Yutong also flew to the other side of the crystal, and with the same appearance, it spat out sword lights and swallowed the souls. After a while, Zhang Yuha's figure became even more voluptuous, and the Yutong's figure also became bigger and even taller. A loud laugh came from the azure ball of light, and another Zhang Yuha appeared from the ball of light. This Zhang Yuha was different from the previous Zhang Yuha. Sword talismans flashed around her body, and her face was filled with joy. That laughter came from her mouth, and it resounded through the entire blood-red space. Rise! Zhang Yuha gracefully stood on the ball of light like a dragonfly. She casually pointed, and a sword light pierced the sky, piercing through the light curtain that had been sealed long ago. With a loud bang, that sword light actually easily penetrated through. Little friend Zhang, what are you doing? Yu Qingtian originally had his eyes closed, and when he saw Zhang Yu's actions, he couldn't help but cry out in alarm, and immediately flew up from the ground. Of course, I'm condensing the sword heart. Zhang Yuha stopped laughing and said coldly. Through the gap in the great array that Zhang Yuha had created, the torrential rain poured down, and the whistling hurricane also rushed into it. Buzz, buzz. However, this overwhelming torrential rain was still unable to stop the soaring sword will. The broken swords and sword wills within 100 miles were stimulated by this sword will, and they broke through the torrential rain and flew toward the Buddhist gold great array. Little friend Zhang, condensing the sword heart doesn't seem to be within the scope of our cooperation. Yu Qingtian's expression was solemn, and he squinted his eyes slightly as he looked at Zhang Yuha. How is it not within the scope of our cooperation? Zhang Yuha's cold face squeezed out a smile. The purpose of refining the great yin-yang 6 directions sword spirit is to form the sword heart. Only with the sword heart can one step into the sword transformation realm. Okay, Yu Qingtian didn't seem to want to argue with Zhang Yuha. He pointed his finger at the crimson ball of light and said, since you want to condense the sword heart, what about my Yutong? Why doesn't he come out and condense the sword heart? His cultivation has only just stepped into the illusory sword realm, right? He's still a bit far from condensing the sword heart. Zhang Yuha said disdainfully. Then, how's the refining of his 6 directions yang spirit? Yu Qingtian asked again. Take a look for yourself. Zhang Yuha pointed at the Yutong beside the crimson crystal and said, although it's still weak, it's already on the verge of completion. This sword can be considered to have completed the earliest agreement with you. Oh, Yu Qingtian looked at the Yutong, who was a little sluggish at first, but after devouring the soul's and blood essence, his eyes became more and more lively, and he nodded slightly. If that's the case, Yu Qingtian said word by word, the great Yin-Yang Six Directions sword spirit has been successfully refined, and our agreement can be considered to have been completed. Condensing the sword heart is not within the scope of our agreement, so I'm afraid I can't agree to it. Ha ha, Zhang Yue laughed and said, Sect Master Yu, isn't it bad for both of us to have a falling out at this time? The sword spirit of your Yutong has not been completely refined yet. Yu Qingtian still shook his head. Young friend Zhang, don't think that this old man doesn't know. If you transform into a sword, how can this old man and the others restrain you? If you go back on your words, this old man and the others will. Unfortunately, before Yu Qingtian could finish speaking, Zhang Yuhe laughed nastily and said, If you want to stop this sword now, is it too late? As she spoke, the crimson color around Zhang Yuhe, who was in front of the crimson crystal, became thicker. She pointed at the crimson crystal that was covered by the sword light. The crimson light emitted by the crystal shook violently, and an unparalleled powerful suction force was born from the crimson light. The remaining cultivators in the small square, who were bitterly resisting the blood sacrifice, could not resist it, and all their souls and blood essence came out of their bodies. This all, naturally, did not include Xiao Hua. However, Xiao Hua's situation was not optimistic. He had just released his soul strands when he silently recited the secret technique of refining the yin-yang gourd during the blood sacrifice in the yin-yang Two Springs Mountain that day. He urged the soul strands to resist the powerful power of the blood sacrifice. When the two forces were balanced, he hurriedly waved his hand and took out the wishful staff. After raising it, he was about to smash it toward the small house. But at this time, Zhang Yuhe and Yu Qingtian fell out and accelerated the speed of the blood sacrifice. This blood sacrifice battle was mysterious, so how could Xiao Hua resist it with his soul cultivation power? Suddenly, he felt that the suction force was pulling his soul strands and his blood essence, and even the dark clouds of his soul were about to come out. Xiao Hua's soul was scattered, so how could he still care about destroying the small house? In a hurry, he had an idea. He clapped his hand and took out the yin-yang sword gourd. He swung his hand and put it on top of his head. Xiao Hua had held the yin-yang sword gourd for a long time, but he did not know how to use it. At this time, when he saw the same blood sacrifice as refining them, he had to take it out and try it. Chapter 26:04. Sure enough, Xiao Hua's soul strands wrapped around the scarlet red and azure sword gourds. Activating a secret technique, the soul strands trembled, and the two sword gourds released a scarlet red and azure brilliance respectively. The two sword gourds also produced a huge suction force, just like the suction force from the hut, and resisted the powerful force produced by Zhang Yuhe through the blood sacrifice array. Phew, feeling the qi and blood in his body gradually calm down, Xiao Hua finally heaved a sigh of relief. He quietly clenched his fists, which had long been covered in cold sweat. At this moment, there was a huge change outside the blood sacrifice array. As Zhang Yuhe forcefully activated the blood sacrifice array, the remaining thousands of souls were extracted. Half of them entered the body of the Six Directions Yin spirit, and the other half was unexpectedly given to the Six Directions Yang spirit. Yu Qingtian, who was about to activate the Silver Tiger, hesitated at this moment. Although Zhang Yuhe had violated their agreement by forcefully condensing the sword heart after cultivating the great Yin-Yang Six Directions sword spirit, Zhang Yuhe did not forget their agreement and still helped Yutong refine the Six Directions Yang spirit. This made it difficult for Yu Qingtian to decide whether to fall out with Zhang Yuhe or not. While Yu Qingtian was hesitating, the flying swords, which were much more powerful than before, rushed into the Brahma gold array with sword intent and sword chi. Rise! There was a smile on Zhang Yuha's face, but there was also a serious look on her face. She pointed with her finger, and the ball of light, which was covered with sword talismans and flashed with a layer of blood-red light, suddenly flew above Zhang Yuha's head. The flying sword, sword intent, and sword chi all rushed into the ball of light. Buzz, 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 the ball of light began to tremble violently. As the flying swords, sword intent, and sword chi rushed in, the azure ball of light began to boil again. The sword talismans on the surface of the ball of light spun crazily like an alchemy furnace. Yu Qingtian watched from afar and bit his lip. From time to time, he would look at the six directions yang spirit that was devouring the souls. There was also the six directions yin spirit that was still in perfect condition. The six directions yang spirit in Yu Tong's image did not seem to be complete, so the devouring process was slightly slower. It took a full hour. After the six directions yin spirit in Zhang Yuha's image finished devouring the souls, there was a hint of a smile in its eyes. It looked thoughtfully at Yu Tong, devouring the remaining souls, and it did not stop him. This also prevented Yu Qingtian from making a move. At this time, there were already a lot of flying swords, sword intent, and sword chi that had rushed into the azure light ball. Not only did the light ball not expand, it became even smaller. It was only 70% the size of the crimson light ball beside it. Moreover, from the bottom of the light ball, there was another azure crystal thread that was as thin as a hair. It was connected to the crimson light ball beside the light ball, and it slowly hung down on Zhang Yuha's forehead. As soon as the azure threads came into contact with Zhang Yuha's skin, they immediately disappeared, and even longer threads emerged from the ball of light. With a loud bang, the moment the crystal thread entered Zhang Yuha's glabella, the azure light emitted a brilliant sword light. The sword talisman flowed wildly within the sword light, and a huge lotus flower was born from the sword light. Oh no! Seeing an unconcealable sharp aura emanating from the lotus flower, Yu Qingtian immediately came to his senses and shouted, "Zhang Yuha, this lotus flower is your sword intent?" Ha ha! Zhang Yuha laughed, and the azure sword light that had soared into the sky suddenly retracted and fell on the lotus flower. The wind and rain that filled the sky also slowly disappeared, and the flying swords and other things that had passed through the Brahma gold array also gradually decreased. However, all the sword intent and sword chi that had flown and were absorbed by Zhang Yuha's lotus flower sword intent. This sword is called Yuha, so naturally, I want to use the lotus flower as my sword intent. Zhang Yuha said proudly, "The lotus flower grows out of the mud without being stained. This is my lifelong pursuit." Good. Yu Qingtian raised his hand and looked at the six directions yang spirit in the image of Yu Tong devouring the last dozen living souls. He shouted, "When my boy's six directions yang spirit is cultivated, our agreement will be fulfilled. You can go wherever you want to condense your sword heart, and I will not interfere. Even if you want to condense your sword heart here, you can. However, you have to wait until I remove the Brahma Gold Palace. Otherwise, I will definitely not allow you to condense your sword heart here." As he spoke, the silver tiger flashed with a silver brilliance. The silver tiger roared angrily and transformed into a huge tiger with slender eyes that landed in midair. "Io, this sword is so scared." Zhang Yuha patted her towering chest and looked very scared. However, the playful smile in her eyes was not the fear that Yu Qingtian had hoped for. "This sword has already started condensing my sword heart." Zhang Yuha's face turned cold. "Do you think you can still stop this sword?" "What? Yu Qingtian was shocked. His gaze fell on the crystal thread on Zhang Yuha's forehead, and he suddenly realized something. "Your sword spirit is not this. Six directions, yin spirit? Ha! When did this sword say that I want to use this six directions, yin spirit as my sword spirit?" Zhang Yuha laughed, as if she was a little girl boy who had stolen candy from someone else and only revealed the truth after she had eaten the candy. This sword already had its own sword spirit when it was conceived. Why would I still need this six directions spirit as my sword spirit? You are now a sword spirit? Yu Qingtian's face turned pale as he said in disbelief. Yes and no, no and no, Zhang Yu has said with a smile. How can a Dao sect cultivator like you know the secret arts of sword cultivation? Then she glanced at the six directions spirit that had just swallowed the last living soul and smiled. Wait until this sword refines the real great yang six direction sword spirit. Then you will know what it is. Roar, Yu Qingtian roared angrily. Zhang Yuha, how dare you violate the agreement between us? You have made a blood oath. Blood oath. Zhang Yuha stretched out her hand and said in confusion, the warriors of my divine sword region only recognize sword oaths. They have never heard of blood oaths. Yu Qingtian was so angry that his face turned green. However, since it's a blood oath, this sword is also afraid. Zhang Yu has said with a smile, but this sword made a blood oath with you so that I can successfully refine the great yang six directions sword spirit. At this time, the six directions spirit and the six directions yang spirit have not been completely refined. Why do you say that this sword has violated the agreement? At this point, how could Yu Qingtian not know that he had fallen into Zhang Yu's trap? Zhang Yu's real purpose was only to step into the sword transformation realm. Of course, this purpose was also the agreement between Yu Qingtian and Zhang Yuha. However, he never expected that Zhang Yuha would not rely on the great yang six direction sword spirit to transform into a sword. Instead, she relied on the power of the living souls from the blood sacrifice and accompanied the six directions spirit to secretly cultivate her own sword spirit. In particular, during each blood sacrifice, Zhang Yuha would attract the remaining flying swords, sword intent, and sword chi from the sword catacomb. At that time, Yu Qingtian was still complacent and thought that Zhang Yuha had really kept her promise. In order to show her sincerity, she even helped the disciples of the falling gold mountain to improve their cultivation. Who would have thought that Zhang Yuha would absorb the flying swords, sword intent, and sword chi from the ball of light to temper her own sword intent? At the last blood sacrifice, she even used the sword intent from the sword transformation realm to attract enough sword chi and other things, providing the opportunity for the sword intent and sword spirit to fuse. The crystal thread under the sword intent was probably something that had been tempered to the extreme by the sword intent. It was probably the link between the sword intent and the sword spirit. Of course, this was not the most important thing. Yu Qingtian could tell that the great yang six direction sword spirit was an extremely powerful sword cultivator technique. He had chosen Yu Tong to refine the six directions sword spirit with Zhang Yuha. Zhang Yuha had transformed into a sword, but Yu Tong was still in the ball of light and had not come out. No one knew the specific situation, so he had probably fallen into Zhang Yuha's control long ago. Furthermore, refining the six direction sword spirit had cost nearly 100,000 lives, so Yu Tong's living soul might not be able to escape. Perhaps this was one of the conditions for refining the six directions yang spirit. Furthermore, after the two sword spirits of six harmonies devoured the living souls and blood essences, they spat out crimson and azure sword rays from their mouths and noses. They struck the crimson light around the crimson crystal, and the crimson light gradually shrank back under the sword rays. It was barely holding on. Zhang Yuha must have been plotting against the core of the blood sacrifice formation. Therefore, how could Yu Qingtian delay any longer with Zhang Yuha? He roared angrily, "Go to hell!" Following his roar, Yu Qingtian cast the spell that he had already made. As the brilliance flashed, Zhang Yuha's body suddenly bloomed with resplendent sword light. The silver chain that had flashed out of Zhang Yuha's body earlier did not appear as Yu Qingtian had expected. Instead, several silver streams of light appeared from time to time above the azure lotus. Ha ha! Zhang Yuhe laughed loudly. Your Dao Sex imprisonment technique only imprisons the physical body, not the vital essence. How can it imprison the sword spirit of this sword? This sword is already transformed into a sword, so your so-called imprisonment chain is just a joke. Yu Qingtian sneered when he saw that Zhang Yuhe had already seen through his trick. He pointed his finger at the silver tiger that was flying in the air. A silver light flashed in the silver tiger's eyes, and an obscure fluctuation was emitted from the silver light toward Zhang Yuhe. When the fluctuation reached her in an instant, Zhang Yuhe let out a heart-wrenching cry. Flashing silver chains appeared around Zhang Yuhe's body. The chains turned inch by inch and tightened inch by inch, directly strangling Zhang Yuhe's flesh and bones. Even though she had already transformed into a sword, she could not help but cry out. Little friend Zhang, Yu Qingtian seemed to still not want to push things to a dead end. He said in a low voice, "My Dao sect still has many tricks up its sleeve. This is just a child's play. Although you are a sword cultivator, a blood oath is still useful. When you made the blood oath, it was not desirable. Now that you have transformed into a sword, the blood oath is still effective. Why don't you and I each take a step back? You let my boy go and destroy all the hidden hands, and I will also remove the bone-corroding silver chain. What do you think?" Ha ha! Zhang Yuhe endured the unspeakable pain and laughed. "How'd I make the blood oath that day? Don't forget that the blood oath I made was that I can't transform into a sword in this life, and can only be a sword spirit. However, look, I have already transformed into a sword. Is your bullshit blood oath useful?" Chapter 26:05. Little friend Zhang, are you serious about going against me to the end? Yu Qingtian sneered. What a joke. This sword has already transformed into a sword. What can a little gold core cultivator like you do to this sword? Zhang Yuhe's body glowed with a boundless azure sword light, which pierced straight towards the countless thin silver light strands around her. Quick! Yu Qingtian did not dare to be negligent. He made a hand seal and hit the silver tiger again. The fluctuations on the silver tiger changed again, and the silver chains that bound Zhang Yuhe spun faster. There were even sawtooth-like notches on the chains, and another heart-wrenching scream came from Zhang Yuhe's mouth. Her face was extremely ferocious. Zhang Yuhe couldn't bear it any longer. Her entire body glowed brightly, and a flying sword of the same size as her gradually appeared from within her body. Her figure slowly hid within the flying sword. However, as the flying sword transformed, the lotus sword intent, which had shrunk to the size of 3 feet, stopped shrinking, and the azure crystal threads also gradually faded. As soon as the flying sword transformed, an overwhelming sword force was emitted from the flying sword. It was like the pressure of a nascent soul cultivator, and it enveloped Yu Qingtian. However, the sword force was trembling and was not very stable. Obviously, Zhang Yuhe had not completely transformed into a sword. Yu Qingtian did not dare to be negligent. He patted his forehead and released the pressure of a gold core cultivator at the same time, barely resisting the immature sword force. However, at this moment, there was a soft swoosh and a sword light flashed. Yu Qingtian was almost caught off guard. The azure sword light had already struck the body of the silver tiger that was emitting fluctuations, transforming into a sword. It's really amazing. Yu Qingtian's eyes narrowed slightly when he felt the almost torrential sword chi above the sword light and the rolling of the surrounding golden spiritual chi. It's really different from an illusory sword. Even so, there was no surprise on Yu Qingtian's face. Sure enough, when the terrifying sword light struck, the silver tiger was like an illusion and did not receive any damage at all. Instead, the silver tiger raised its head and roared angrily. The silver chain on the flying sword once again produced blood-colored threads of light. The threads of light wrapped around the flying sword, and actually corroded the sword beam of the flying sword. Zhang Yue, you want to destroy the silver tiger within the Brahma Gold Great Array? Dream on. Yu Qing Tian sneered. Without any hesitation, he urged the silver tiger again. The blood-colored light turned into bloody flowers that frantically burned the flying sword that Zhang Yue had transformed into. Roar! A roar seemed to come from her throat. The sword was gradually collapsing under the entanglement of the silver light and the burning of the blood. Zhang Yue's figure became invisible in the sword light. At this moment, Zhang Yue was no longer as arrogant as before. In fact, she looked extremely miserable. The silver light was like a sawtooth chain that was deeply embedded into her body. Countless tiny wounds were vaguely visible on her sword-like skin. Moreover, the burning of the blood directly penetrated into her body, as if her entire skin was reflecting a blood-red color. The blood-red color and the sword light intersected from time to time. It looked really bloody. Zhang Yue's eyes were wide open as she opened her small mouth. Not only was her beautiful face deformed, but the silver chain also covered her entire body. Even her hands and arms were struggling with all their might, but they were also bound by the silver chain. She was far from being able to use her magical sword-transforming ability. I'll fight you to the death. Zhang Yue was so helpless that she screamed hysterically. She opened her mouth and spat out a small sword. In an instant, it turned into a rainbow and rapidly pierced between Yu Qing Tian's eyebrows. Oomph. Wishful thinking. Yu Qing Tian sneered when he saw Zhang Yue's final struggle and spat out her small sword. He stretched out his hand and threw out the magical weapon that he had prepared long ago. It was a silver shield that was the size of a palm. After flying out, it immediately turned into a shiny piece and blocked in front of Yu Qing Tian. Puff, 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 puff. A series of sounds came from the shield. The small sword was so sharp that it instantly pierced through more than 10 layers of the shield. However, the shiny shield seemed to be endless. No matter how many layers the small sword pierced, it would create a new one. Seeing that the shield had blocked the small sword, Yu Qing Tian's lips curled into a smile. However, just as this smile appeared, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. A golden core cultivator's instinct sensed that an unparalleled danger was coming from under his feet. Almost without thinking, he moved his body and was about to dodge elsewhere. Unfortunately, he was still too late. Perhaps the two green and red sword lights that flew from the blood-red crystal were too fast. Just as his body flashed, the two sword lights flew over and twisted around his left leg. His entire left leg was twisted into a bloody pulp, and this bloody pulp seeped into the sword lights and disappeared. It was only at this moment that Yu Qing Tian realized that he seemed to have completely ignored the Six Directions sword spirit. He even looked at the Yu Tong, who raised his head and looked at him in disbelief. There was no pity in this Six Directions yang spirit's eyes, only coldness. Yu Qing Tian's physical body was injured, and he didn't dare to delay. He hurriedly clapped his hands and swallowed a spirit pill. Then he cast a few spells on the wound on his left leg to stop the blood from gushing out. However, before he could stand firmly in midair, he felt a huge gust of wind in the space. Buzz, at the same time, Zhang Yue, who was in the distance, once again emitted a bright sword light, and the huge sword cry sounded again. With a strange smile on her face, Zhang Yue's figure disappeared into the flying sword again. In the entire space, all the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was suddenly swept up by her, setting off a tyrannical airflow that rushed into the flying sword like a whirlwind. Even Yu Qing Tian himself couldn't stand still in midair. Yu Qing Tian sucked in a breath of cold air and hurriedly pointed in the direction of the silver tiger. Unfortunately, the silver tiger's body emitted a strong silver light, but the spiritual energy of heaven and earth around it couldn't gather. It seemed that it couldn't compete with the suction force of the sword. Yu Qing Tian was very anxious. Regardless of the fact that he was standing on one leg in midair, he waved his hands and cast a few more obscure spells. Dozens of light threads shot out from his hands and shot toward the six directions of the Buddhist gold great array. Buzz, the light threads disappeared into the sky. In six places that couldn't be seen with the naked eye, suddenly roared. A huge amount of golden spiritual energy of heaven and earth surged out and was about to be sucked into the silver tiger. However, at this moment, the ka sound was heard as Zhang Yuha's figure disappeared, and the huge sword expanded from the flying sword. Yu Qingtian scanned with his divine thoughts and saw that the layers of Tarsus silver threads that bound Zhang Yuha had been forced out of the flying sword by the dazzling sword light. Whether it was the sawtooth silver light or the blood-red sparks, they were now floating outside the sword light. Several silver threads were even broken inch by inch under the shroud of the sword light and under the expansion of the huge sword. Yu Qingtian understood that it wasn't that Zhang Yuha didn't have the ability to resist, but that she used the Tarsus silver threads as bait to attract his attention and use it to injure him with the six directions sword spirit. This woman is really too cunning. Yu Qingtian shuddered, but he saw that the Tarsus silver threads were breaking like an avalanche, gradually expanding from a single point. All the silver threads were on the verge of breaking, and the ka sound were continuous. Forget it. A trace of regret flashed in Yu Qingtian's eyes. He glanced at the huge sword and then at the six directions sword spirit, who was using the sword light to devour the blood-red crystal and was as thin as a sheet of paper. He said fiercely, "Even if this old man dies, I won't let you have your way." As he spoke, Yu Qingtian recited a strange incantation, and the blood-red light and black fog were emitted from his glabella again. Ha! Zhang Yuha's arrogance reverberated throughout the entire space. At this moment, she was indeed confident in her victory. Puff! There was an extremely soft sound, and a cloud of blood fog was emitted from Yu Qingtian's left arm. Yu Qingtian's left arm was completely gone, and this blood fog was formed from the flesh and blood of his left arm. Yu Qingtian's face was ghastly pale. He had lost his left arm and left leg in succession, and his physical body was greatly damaged. However, he still managed to stand in the air and did his best. This was because he knew that Yutong was finished, but there were still thousands of disciples of the Yu family from Fallen Gold Mountain in this Buddhist gold formation. These disciples were now like fish waiting to be slaughtered by Zhang Yuha. Yu Qingtian was the only one who could save them. Go! As Yu Qingtian pointed his finger, the blood fog turned into a blood arrow and shot into the blood-red crystal. Zhang Yuha was currently breaking free from the tarsal silver threads, and the sword spirit of six harmonies did not receive Zhang Yuha's command. The blood fog fell into the crystal without any hindrance. With a swoosh, the blood-red color of the crystal shone brightly. However, the blood-red color was extremely bright, and it almost caused the two sword spirits to retreat slightly. Crack! There was another soft sound, and a crack appeared in the crystal. What are you doing? Zhang Yuha's voice was like a golden drum. At this moment, the tarsal silver threads had been completely covered by the sword light and had escaped from the giant's sword. Bang! There was a loud sound, and a thick, black fog of blood sprang out from the crystal. At the same time, the entire crystal broke into pieces and scattered in midair. As the crystal broke, the thousands of blood-red lights also disappeared. The small squares hanging from the blood-red lights slowly came to a stop, and just like before, they floated messily in the silver light. Damn it! Zhang Yuha was furious. Her whole body shook, and the shadow of a giant sword slashed out. It streaked across the air, and in an instant, it was in front of Yu Qingtian. Yu Qingtian was naturally prepared. With a wave of his hand, the silver shield blocked the giant sword once again. Rumble! There was a loud sound from the shield, as if a big machete had split open a cabbage. Even if the cabbage had complete leaves, it would still be split open. In the end, the cabbage could not withstand the sharpness of the machete. Seeing that the shield was split open so easily, Yu Tian was disheartened. The strength of a sword transformation swordsman was far from what he could resist. Chapter 26:06. Wu, the giant sword continued to fall and was about to split Yu Tian into two halves. Even the golden light protecting Yu Tian's body was trembling rapidly. At this critical moment, a clanging sound came from the bottom of the Buddhist gold great array. Kong Kong. It sounded like someone was knocking on the door, but it also sounded like someone was pounding on the door. Zhang Yuha was suddenly stunned. The giant sword stopped in midair, and Yu Tian took the opportunity to roll up a layer of silver light around his body. He suddenly disappeared from where he was, and after a while, he appeared several feet away. Escape technique? Zhang Yuha's divine sense swept over, and a strange look flashed in her eyes. Then, she swept her divine sense and gazed to the place where the sound came from. That was where Zhang Yuha and Yu Tian had just performed the blood sacrifice, and the sound came from one of the grids. Someone actually escaped the blood sacrifice. Not only was Zhang Yuha shocked, but Yu Tian was also stunned. With a loud bang, a huge gap suddenly appeared in the corner of the small grid. Then, two rays of light, one green and one red, rushed out. Finally, an ordinary-looking cultivator jumped out of the gap with a 3-foot-long magic wand in his hand. Wasn't that Xiao Hua, who had finally escaped after the suction of the blood-colored crystal disappeared? Zhang Yua's gaze swept past Xiao Hua, but it didn't stop there. Her gaze landed on the green and red brilliance of light with extreme surprise. Not only did Zhang Yua's gaze fall on the sword gourd, but even the Six Directions sword spirit, who had opened its mouth to swallow the blood-colored crystal, stopped. Its eyes flashed, and its gaze showed instinctive resistance, contempt, and other expressions. Yin-yang sword gourd? Zhang Yuha couldn't help but groan. However, Zhang Yuha had just identified the yin-yang sword spirit when she saw Xiao Hua wave his Taoist robe, and the two sword gourds fell into his Taoist robe and disappeared. Feng Yu Tian looked at Xiao Hua's young face and the new Taoist robe in disbelief. You, how are you still alive? Yu Tian, who knew that the enemy was right in front of him, couldn't help but groan and ask. Xiao Hua put away the yin-yang sword gourd and scanned the place with his divine sense. He had already seen the whole situation clearly. Zhang Yuha? Why is she here? Furthermore, how did her cultivation suddenly transform into a sword? Motherfucker, it must be the result of this stupid blood sacrifice. Earlier on, I had been trying to guess Zhang Yuha's whereabouts with Zhang Qingxiao. Now, it seems that Zhang Yuha has really been held hostage by a Dao sect cultivator. However, this time it wasn't a cultivation sect, but a cultivation family. This war between Dao cultivators was really not started by Zhang Qingxiao alone. The Dao sect cultivators were also involved. Although Xiao Hua's heart tightened, he didn't dare to show any surprise on his face. He tightened his grip on the wishful staff, scratched his head, stretched out his left hand, and waved very hard. From his face, he squeezed out a harmless smile. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. You two, I went to the wrong place. You continue. I will go out now. After saying that, Xiao Hua looked around and flew towards the edge of the blood sacrifice array. Haha, how interesting. Zhang Yuha's figure appeared in a flash from the giant sword. The sword light that was slashing toward Yu Tian did not dissipate. It was still condensed in the air, and its momentum was very oppressive. To be able to get out of the blood sacrifice array, your cultivation is really beyond this sword's expectations. Zhang Yuha didn't have the intention to let Xiao Hua go. However, since this sword has seen you, do you think you can easily escape from this sword's hands? Xiao Hua flew to the edge of the blood sacrifice array and looked at the silver brilliance near him. He turned around and smiled apologetically. This kid really came to the sword tomb to admire the purple jasmine flower. I came here purely because I was lost. This kid can make a blood oath. As for the matter between Master Hua Jian and this golden core stage senior, this kid didn't see anything. After this kid gets out of here, I will immediately return to Ming country and will never come to the sword tomb again. Whether it is about Master Huajian or this golden core stage senior, this kid will definitely not say a word. Fellow Taoist Feng, Yu Qingtian hurriedly shouted, "This old man doesn't know which master you are under." There was really a misunderstanding before. Fortunately, fellow Taoist didn't receive any injuries. This old man, forget it, this old man won't say anything superfluous. As long as fellow Taoist helps this old man trim out this Huan country sword, my falling Gold Mountain's Yu family will be deeply grateful to fellow Taoist. If fellow Taoist wants anything from my falling Gold Mountain, this old man will definitely not say a word. I can even share everything that happened in the Washing Flower sect with fellow Taoist. The Washing Flower sect's vice sect masters have a really good relationship with my Yu family. In the future, my Yu family will take care of everything that fellow Taoist does in the Washing Flower sect. Senior Yu, you think too highly of this kid. Xiaohua hated Yu Qingtian to death. He actually exposed his lie in one breath. However, he still smiled bitterly. This kid is only a foundation establishment stage cultivator. You, a golden core stage cultivator, can't even deal with Master Huajian. What can this kid do? Just now, I was lucky enough to escape with my life. It was just a little secret technique of this kid. Don't drag this kid to his death. As he spoke, Xiaohua flew towards the silver light again. He knew that he had some methods, but against Zhang Yuhe, who had transformed into a sword, he really didn't have the confidence. Moreover, the most important thing was that he didn't want to get involved in the matter between Zhang Yuhe and Falling Gold Mountain. If he had the chance, he definitely wouldn't let go of Falling Gold Mountain. Do you want to stay out of this? Zhang Yuhe's figure flashed within the huge sword. Her human form and sword form were constantly switching, as if she was comprehending the realm of transforming into a sword, and also seemed to be familiarizing herself with the methods of transforming into a sword. Master Huajian, hearing this, Xiaohua, who had just flown a few feet, stopped again. Now that you already have the upper hand, and this kid is harmless to you, you can go back to Huan country and never meet this kid again. Why can't you have the virtue of cherishing life and let this kid off lightly? Moreover, at this time, the battle between the Tao cultivators outside the sword tomb is in full swing. Wouldn't it be better for you to go out and kill a few more golden core stage cultivators and help the sword cultivators win? There's no reason for you to waste useless time with this kid here. Xiaohua was now earnestly advising, just like an eager father and mother advising an unfilial descendant who didn't want to contribute to the country. And what you said is also reasonable. Zhang Yuhe looked at Yu Qingtian, who had almost lost half of his flesh, and nodded. To this sword, it really doesn't matter to me whether I kill you or not. Many thanks, Master Huajian. Xiaohua was overjoyed and quietly flew a few feet. But Zhang Yuhe's tone changed. Xiaohua's heart tightened, and he anxiously said, Master Huajian, what else do you want? Nothing. Zhang Yuhe smiled. This sword just wants to remind you that you are now inside the Buddhist Gold Great Array. Without this sword or Yu Qingtian's help, I'm afraid it will be difficult for you to get out of this Great Array. Is that so? Then what should I do? Xiaohua's hand slightly swung the wishful wand. Although your wand is powerful and can break the blood sacrifice's nest, if you want to break this Great Array, you need the silver tiger controlling the Great Array. Zhang Yuhe said with a smile. Xiaohua scratched his head again and smiled bitterly. Senior Yu, I'm afraid you won't open the array, right? Master Huajian, what do you mean? This sword is telling you this because I want to negotiate with you. Zhang Yuhe smiled. This sword will tear a gap in this Great Array and let you out, but you have to pay this sword a reward. Oh, what reward? Xiaohua was stunned. He really didn't expect Zhang Yuhe to let him out. Naturally, it's the yin-yang sword gourd you just took. Zhang Yuhe said without hiding anything. This thing is still very useful to this sword. If you take it out, this sword will let you live and tear the Great Array. So that's how it is. Xiaohua's gaze swept and saw the two sword spirits swallowing the blood mist. Although he didn't know why these two things were in the image of Yutong and Zhang Yuhe, the crimson and azure sword light was the sword light of the yin-yang sword gore that day. It seems these two people used the blood of cultivators to refine. It's these two sword spirits. Xiao Hua had already understood, but he still hesitated. Master Huajian, are you talking about the two green and red gourds just now? Yes, it's that thing. Zhang Yuhe nodded. This sword is very curious. This thing is the yin-yang sword gourd of sword cultivators. Where did you get it? Master Huajian, then what is the use of this so-called sword gourd? Xiao Hua didn't answer, but asked instead. What are you pretending for in front of this sword? Zhang Yuhe didn't hesitate to remove Xiao Hua's disguise. This sword will tell you. Do you dare to listen? I don't dare. It's all this little one's mouth. Xiao Hua hurriedly clapped his hands and took out the yin-yang sword gourd. With one in each hand, he held it up and smiled apologetically. This little one picked it up from somewhere else. Since it's a sword cultivator's item, this little one has no use for it. If I can use it to exchange for my life, this little one will naturally be happy. This little one will now give this whatever sword gourd to Master Huajian. But please make a blood oath. Humph. In the distance, Yu Qingtian didn't seem careless because he was ignored. He snorted coldly from his nostrils, looking down on Xiao Hua's cautiousness very much. He almost told Xiao Hua that sword cultivators use sword oaths and not blood oaths. But Zhang Yuhe was also straightforward. She said coldly, this sword has never made any blood oath. If I want to make a blood oath, it's my sword realm's sword oath. However, do you think a foundation establishment cultivator like you is worthy of a sword transformation swordsman making a sword oath? Just now, this sword saw that you had the yin-yang sword gourd, so I didn't suddenly kill you. Do you think a foundation establishment cultivator can dodge this sword? While she was speaking, the flying sword not far from Yu Qingtian let out a clear clang sound, seemingly agreeing with Zhang Yuhe's words. Xiao Hua pondered for a moment and said with a smile, this little one naturally understands. This little one doesn't need master's sword oath or blood oath. This little one will hand over the sword gourd to master. I ask master to let this little one live. Saying this, Xiao Hua quietly pressed his two thumbs on the sword gourd. With a shake of his hand, he sent it into the air. When the two sword gourds left Xiao Hua's hands, the scarlet and azure sword light slightly flashed, seemingly concealing something. Chapter 26:07. However, this sword light didn't attract anyone's attention. Not bad. You're much more tactful than Yu Qingtian. Zhang Yuhe laughed. Since you're so cooperative with me, how can I not send you on your way? With that, Zhang Yuhe waved her hand, and two sword gourds quickly fell into her hands. Zhang Yuhe struck several sword seals on the sword gourds, and the sword gourds emitted extremely brilliant sword light. The scarlet and azure colors were as dazzling as the sun and the moon. This seems to be the clear sword sex sacrificial refining technique. How can you pick it up so easily? Zhang Yuhe whispered in a strange tone. Although Xiao Hua heard her voice echoing in the silent Buddhist gold great array, he turned a deaf ear and didn't intend to answer. Of course, Zhang Yuhe didn't expect an answer from him. Zhang Yuhe pointed with her finger, and a pure, crystal-like azure sword light flew out. The sword light was extremely thin, and it was extremely similar to the crystal thread that came out from the sword intent. The sword light landed on the six directions Een Spirit's glabella, and the six directions Een Spirit immediately became sluggish and motionless like a puppet. Go! Zhang Yuhe scolded softly, and the azure sword gourd streaked across the air and covered the sword spirit. Return. Zhang Yuhe shook the sword light in her hand. In the six directions, Een Spirit's body began to turn into light and slowly rushed into the azure sword gourd. The sword gourd twisted extremely, and gradually, a human-shaped gourd slowly appeared. That, Master Huajian. Xiao Hua saw that Zhang Yuhe actually ignored him and began to sacrificial refine the sword gourd. So he coughed and said, Master, let me go? You have plenty of time to do the things you love. Humph, Zhang Yue snorted coldly and ignored Xiaohua. As usual, she followed the gourd's pattern and pointed her finger. A similar crystal thread came out of the scarlet light next to her, but the crystal thread was extremely thin and couldn't be seen clearly. Similarly, the six directions spirit in the shape of the jade symbol was also sluggish like a puppet when the crystal thread pierced its glabella, allowing the scarlet sword gourd to slowly absorb it. Are you going to leave? Don't you want me to send you on your way? Seeing that everything was over, Zhang Yue was perfectly satisfied. She looked at Xiaohua, who had quietly flown several feet away. Hearing this, Xiaohua hurriedly stopped and somewhat awkwardly smiled apologetically. Master Huajian, you are currently doing what you love to do. This little one, it's better not to disturb you. If I can walk by myself, it's better to walk by myself. I don't want to trouble you. How can you not take my words seriously? Zhang Yue sneered, as if she was angry. Her whole body shook, and a sharp sword light flashed, piercing toward Xiaohua. Xiaohua felt that this flying sword was even faster than his punishing dream and mountain splitter. He unconsciously shrunk his neck and wanted to dodge. Fortunately, this sword light wasn't aimed at Xiaohua. Instead, it hit the silver light screen. With a swoosh, a crack as big as a person was torn open. Xiaohua was overjoyed. He didn't dare to bow and hurriedly flew towards the crack. He still shouted, "Many thanks, Master Huajian." This little one was resting in the sword tomb today and had a golden millet dream. I didn't see anything. Zhang Yue didn't pay attention to him and turned to look at Yu Qingtian. Yu Qingtian stood there, trembling. He was in an extremely sorry and miserable state. When he saw Zhang Yue looking at him, he begged, "Little friend Zhang, this old man has cooperated with you for several decades. For you, I even bet my falling Gold Mountain's reputation and future. I used 100,000 lives to help you refine the great Yang Six Directions sword spirit. If this were to be known by the cultivators of the 3 cultivation countries, not even dregs of my falling Gold Mountain would be left. Little friend, you can even let go of this unfamiliar washing flower sect disciple. Why can't you let this old man go on account of our cooperation for several decades?" Washing flower sect. Zhang Yue frowned and hurriedly turned her head. She saw that Xiaohua had already flown to the edge of the crack. At this moment, Zhang Yue shook her hand without the slightest hesitation. Woo! An extremely strong sword cry resounded from outside the crack. Shua! A sword light that could split a mountain peak chopped towards Xiaohua. Fight! Xiaohua had long been prepared for this. He raised the wishful staff in his hand. Dang! A huge sound rang out. The sword light was actually blocked by him, and his figure was also shaken down by more than 10 feet. However, a strange thing happened. Xiaohua's figure suddenly disappeared in midair. There was no trace of him at all. Zhang Yue coldly snorted. The huge sword light let out a sword cry and blocked the crack that had just been torn open. Boom! A huge sound rang out, and a deep depression appeared not far away from the sword light. Go! As Zhang Yue pinched her sword, the flying sword drew an arc and stabbed towards the depression. However, as the flying sword passed through the void, it was unable to do much damage. However, after the flying sword left, the crack on the silver light screen quickly closed up. In the space not far from the gap that had just closed, Xiaohua's figure gradually appeared. Xiaohua held the wishful staff in his hand and looked coldly at Zhang Yue. He said faintly, "Master Huajian, what do you mean by this? Didn't you just promise I? Why did you suddenly change your mind?" Change my mind? Do I need a reason? This sword is willing. Zhang Yue smiled and said, "This sword is a woman. A woman's words, can you take it seriously? If you take a woman's words seriously, then you have lost. You are Senior Huajian." After listening to Zhang Yue's words, Xiaohua almost fell from midair. Xiaohua really didn't expect Zhang Yue to be so fickle. She was really far from the swordsman in his impression of the Yuxian assembly. So what if I am Senior Huajian? Zhang Yue sneered. This sword is a woman first, and then a swordsman. Do women need a reason to do things? After listening to Zhang Yuha's words, the image of another female Jindan stage cultivator flashed in Xiao Hua's mind very quickly. If it was not Chun-Yi, who could it be? It seems whether it is a female cultivator or a female swordsman, there will always be some unreasonable. Xiao Hua was really speechless. Even in this flash, he thought of the first time he saw Xue Xue in Yinyuan City. At that time, wasn't Xue Xue generally unreasonable? Xiao Hua said a few words, but he didn't say anything. He knew that Zhang Yuha had changed her mind and didn't want to let him out. His 2 yin-yang sword gourds were wasted. He was afraid that he would have to fight to the death with this master Hua Jian. Thinking of this, Xiao Huan naturally put away his previous apologetic smile. He waved the wishful staff in his hand and patted his forehead. The pressure that was very similar to that of a Jindan stage cultivator was slowly released, and he himself slowly flew in the direction of Yu Qingtian. He knew in his heart that although he was extremely disgusted with Yu Qingtian, and because of some of Yu Qingtian's words just now, he didn't know whether it was intentional or unintentional, which made Zhang Yuha suspicious and cut off his way out. However, at this time, only he and Yu Qingtian were facing Zhang Yuha. He had no choice but to cooperate with Yu Qingtian. At this time, Yu Qingtian's physical body had been greatly damaged. As a Jindan stage cultivator, his cultivation might not be in Xiao Hua's eyes. However, everyone was inside the Brahma Gold Formation. Obviously, Yu Qingtian was the key to controlling the Brahma Gold Formation, and the Silver Tiger, which was still roaring in the air, was probably the center of the formation. Xiao Hua had no choice but to compromise with Yu Qingtian. Of course, Xiao Hua had another plan for approaching Yu Qingtian so closely. Sure enough, when he saw that Xiao Hua was actually a Jindan stage cultivator and was even approaching him, Yu Qingtian was simply overjoyed. He didn't have time to think about Xiao Hua's purpose in coming here. With a wave of his hand, the silver tiger flew in front of him. He landed on it easily, and the silver tiger turned into a stream of light and pounced on Xiao Hua. Yu Qingtian, who was on the silver tiger, hurriedly shouted, "Fellow Taoist Feng, you and I will fight the enemy together." Why said before still stands. Xiao Hua stared at Zhang Yuha and occasionally glanced at Yu Qingtian from the corner of his eyes. He didn't answer Yu Qingtian's temptation. He could take the things from a falling gold mountain, but he wasn't interested in protecting the falling gold mountain at all. Moreover, he also knew in his heart that how could Zhang Yuha make Yu Qingtian join forces with him? If Yu Qingtian hadn't called him back, he might have been able to struggle at death's door for a while, or even he might have been able to preserve his life under Yu Qingtian's flowery words. But at that time, Yu Qingtian was really blinded. He was afraid that the matter of the blood sacrifice would be exposed to the Huan Hua sect, so he spoke out to make him stay. Although he had no way to survive, he had no choice but to cooperate with Yu Qingtian to face Zhang Yuha. But on the other hand, didn't Yu Qingtian personally push him to the edge of the cliff? Faced with a Jindan stage cultivator who was in good condition and a Jindan stage cultivator whose physical body was greatly damaged, it was obvious how Zhang Yuha would decide. This was also the reason why Xiao Hua released his spiritual aura as soon as he turned around and flew toward Yu Qingtian. A Jindan stage cultivator? Interesting. A trace of astonishment flashed through Zhang Yuha's eyes, but she immediately sneered. Indeed, a Jindan stage cultivator was nothing in the eyes of Hua Jian. However, when she saw Yu Qingtian riding the silver tiger to meet up with Xiao Hua, she sneered. It was exactly as Xiao Hua thought. How could she let Yu Qingtian join forces with Xiao Hua? Even if it was a cultivator who was struggling at death's door, it wouldn't work. Go to hell, Zhang Yuha scolded softly. Sword light flashed around her body, and 2 flying sword phantoms rushed out. One slashed toward Yu Qingtian, and the other slashed toward Xiao Hua. This Hua Jian's sword light was extremely powerful. Just as it was born, an incomparably turbulent sharp qi rushed toward them. Even the sword light seemed to be able to cross space, and all of a sudden, it arrived in front of Xiao Hua and Yu Qingtian. "Fight!" Xiao Hua roared. He suddenly raised the wishful steel staff and hit it toward the flying sword with a loud, rumbling sound. Thousands of sword light fragments scattered in the air. Zhang Yue's sword light was actually scattered by Xiao Hua, and Xiao Hua himself, under the huge force of the flying sword, flew diagonally in the direction behind Yu Qingtian. Chapter 26:08. When Yu Qingtian saw that the sword light was about to strike him, he formed a seal with his hands. After a silver light flashed, his figure disappeared from the silver tiger. Gold. Gold escape? Xiao Hua, who was already extremely proficient in escape techniques, could tell at a glance that the secret technique Yu Qingtian used was not some concealment technique, but an escape technique he was familiar with. At this moment, Yu Qingtian was absolutely right to use the gold escape technique. He no longer had any power to resist, and even his defense was barely satisfactory. All he could do was dodge. However, Yu Qingtian made a second fatal mistake. Although his figure disappeared and Zhang Yue's flying sword chopped down, Silver Tiger still did not receive any damage from this flying sword. However, the Silver Tiger was still flying in the air, and it was flying in the direction of Xiao Hua. Sure enough, after a moment, Yu Qingtian's figure appeared less than 1,000 feet in front of Xiao Hua, and the Silver Tiger obediently stopped under him. "Alas, be careful, fellow Taoist Yu." Seeing that Yu Qingtian really appeared not far from him and really appeared on the Silver Tiger, Xiao Hua sighed and could not help but remind him. "Fellow Taoist?" Yu Qingtian was a little puzzled. Zhang Yue's flying sword had clearly just struck the air and dissipated in the distance, but he still hurriedly released his divine thoughts. However, at the same time, the sword light that Zhang Yue had condensed in midair had quietly followed the Silver Tiger's flight and slashed horizontally behind Yu Qingtian's back. "Fellow Taoist, save me." Yu Qingtian was horrified. As he shouted, his figure desperately flew toward Xiao Hua, and he formed a seal with his hands desperately. However, Xiao Hua had no intention of saving him at all. At this time, the flying sword that had been condensed suddenly struck him, and his whole body was imprisoned. Before Yu Qingtian's gold escape technique could be launched, the flying sword had already slashed horizontally at his back. All the armor and golden light that protected his body could not withstand the sword of the swordsman. Yu Qingtian only let out a loud cry before his waist was split in two. The flying sword was so sharp and powerful, but Yu Qingtian's figure was still intact, and the Silver Tiger was still flying with him. However, in the blink of an eye, the silver light around the Silver Tiger trembled violently and was gradually annihilated. The ferocious phantom from just now was gradually absorbed into the celestial artifact and returned to an ordinary celestial artifact. It followed the inertia of Yu Qingtian's corpse and floated toward Xiao Hua. Buzz at Zhang Yue's location. A sword light soared into the sky and flew toward the Silver Tiger like a big hand. "Umph," Xiao Hua sneered, and his figure suddenly moved. Almost like a phantom, he floated toward the Silver Tiger like a ghost. A gust of wind blew past, and Xiao Hua's figure appeared on the left side of the Silver Tiger. He stretched out his hand and was about to grab the Silver Tiger. For Xiao Hua's wind escape technique, a distance of several hundred feet was really a long time. At this time, Zhang Yue's sword light had just flown a distance of several hundred feet. However, just as Xiao Hua's finger was about to fall on the Silver Tiger, the Silver Tiger suddenly turned into a rainbow and flew toward the area of 9 houses in the distance. It seemed that someone was coveting it from the side. "Where are you going?" Xiao Hua sneered, and the heaven and earth sleeve covered the Silver Tiger. Although the Silver Tiger struggled violently, could it defeat Xiao Hua, who was like a tiger and a wolf? Xiao Hua wrapped the Silver Tiger with his mind and sent it into the space. Not only that, After Xiaohua received the silver tiger, his small hand easily reached out and nimbly took off the storage bag on Yu Qingtian's corpse. Seeing that Xiaohua was actually so greedy, Zhang Yue's sword light shone brightly. With a buzz, it flashed and slashed toward his face. Ha ha ha, Xiaohua laughed and roared. You're looking for a beating. Then, without hesitation, he waved the wishful staff, and the staff's shadow hit the mountain-like sword shadow with earth-shattering force. Rumble, there was a tremor like an earthquake, and Xiaohua's figure was sent flying obliquely like a bullet. However, Zhang Yue's sword attack was defeated by Xiaohua once again. After the sound, the whole space was silent for a while. Zhang Yue's attack was suspended, and Yu Qingtian's corpse had fallen to the bottom of the silver brilliance, piled together with the corpses of the blood sacrifice cultivators that he had used every possible means to attract. Those corpses even had their own small lattice as a coffin. However, Yu Qingtian's corpse was split in half, and no one paid any attention to it. Xiaohua held the wishful staff in his hand and stared at Zhang Yuhe in the distance like a tiger watching its prey. At the same time, he was somewhat thoughtful. In this moment, Xiaohua received 3 attacks from Zhang Yuhe. Although Zhang Yuhe sent Xiaohua flying each time, and each attack was more powerful than the last, there was also a limit to this power. For Xiaohua, this kind of attack was even inferior to Qin Jian's, who was only at the 3rd grade of the illusory sword realm. Of course, when Qin Jian faced Xiaohua, he also used the sword transformation secret technique. His attack was comparable to the sword transformation secret technique. But after all, he was comparable to the sword transformation secret technique. His attack could only be inferior to Zhang Yuhe's sword transformation secret technique, and it was impossible for him to surpass Zhang Yuhe's sword transformation secret technique. So why was Zhang Yuhe's attack so weak? On the one hand, Zhang Yuhe's attack was not weak. She cut Yu Qingtian, who had the strength of a gold core, in half with one sword. The sharpness of that sword light was evident. However, this kind of sharpness was against Xiaohua's wishful staff, and it was absolutely difficult to produce the kind of power that could kill Yu Qingtian. The biggest effect of this attack was to send Xiaohua flying, and it couldn't even hurt a single hair on Xiaohua's body. On the other hand, Zhang Yue's attacks hadn't transformed into swords, nor did they contain any sword intent. They were purely strands of sword light, yet these strands of sword light were capable of blasting Xiaohua flying. This proved that Zhang Yuhe's strength was far from what it appeared to be. It's just, why didn't Zhang Yuhe use her killing move? Thinking about the shocking attack of the old man who had transformed into a sword on Foul Crow Mountain, Xiaohua shuddered and looked at Zhang Yuhe with vigilance. When Xiaohua quietly swept his Buddhist awareness over the continuously shrinking lotus sword intent, as well as the crystal threads connected to Zhang Yue's forehead, and even the crimson ball of light near Zhang Yue's left side, as well as the 6-direction sword spirit that was merging with the yin-yang sword gourd, Xiaohua suddenly came to a realization. This fiend, I'm afraid she has just stepped into the sword transformation secret technique, and is still at the stage of the fusion of sword intent and sword spirit. The sword heart required for the sword transformation secret technique. She has yet to condense it. Otherwise, I'm afraid she would have already chased after me. Also, what kind of sword spirit did she refine? Why is it so similar to the yin-yang sword spirit? Right now, that sword gourd, is it being swallowed by her 2 sword spirits? At the critical moment, she doesn't dare to stay away. Xiaohua's mind instantly calculated several times, and he finally understood. If I don't catch her off guard now, when will I? If I let her refine this sword spirit and consolidate the sword transformation secret technique, how can this young master survive? Thinking of this, Xiaohua clapped his hands and took out the seal of turning the sea. He urged his spiritual power, and a buzzing sound could be heard. The seal of turning the sea suddenly expanded, and the coiling dragon on the seal was overflowing with light and color, rolling up the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the surrounding dozens of feet. Go, as Xiao Hua pointed his finger. The coiling dragon roared and flew from the seal. It circled around the seal, opened its hand, held the seal in its mouth, and rushed toward Zhang Yuha. Xiao Hua urged the wind escape technique to follow behind the seal of turning the sea like a shadow. He held the wishful staff in his hand and wanted to fly to Zhang Yuha's left side. Oh, seeing the power of the seal of turning the sea, Zhang Yuha was a little stunned. The coiling dragon's body was rolling with muffled thunder, as if heavenly thunder had streaked across the sky. Although it hadn't come close, the kind of indescribable confinement force had already come, making her sword heart that was in the process of condensing ripples of fear. She couldn't help but be surprised. What a strange boy! Zhang Yue's golden voice sounded. The Huanhua sect actually has such a background. No wonder they dare to support the blood sacrifice of 100,000 creatures in falling Gold Mountain. Xiao Hua didn't want to be long-winded with her. He urged his spiritual power again. Roar! The coiling dragon roared again, and the seal in its mouth spat out, attacking Zhang Yuha. Although Zhang Yuha was surprised, she was still relaxed. She raised her hand, and an azure sword light flew out. With a rumbling sound, it really hit the seal. Xiao Hua's seal, which was able to send the flowing ice valley's hard rock flying for several zhang, actually let out a rumbling sound when it came into contact with this thumb-thin sword light. It violently tumbled and was blocked in midair by that sword light. Fight! Xiao Hua was not discouraged. He chanted incantations, and his hands continuously formed seals. While the seals were tumbling, they fell with a rumbling sound. After several times, they actually managed to defeat the sword light. He, ignorant child, how can you know the methods of a sword cultivator? Zhang Yuha didn't find it strange. She put her hands together and rubbed them slightly. It was as if a shiny lotus flower appeared in her hands out of thin air. Dozens of sword lights flashed brightly, forming a lotus flower, and slowly flew into the air. Above the lotus flower, the sword lights expanded and contracted in different directions, swallowing and spitting out, covering an area of dozens of feet. Fight! Xiao Hua urged the seal of turning sea again. Although the sealing power of the seal of turning sea was extremely strong, and the sword lights flickered under the seal of turning sea, these dozens of sword lights were like a sword formation, or perhaps a hole. All the sword lights rotated and alternately blocked the seal of turning sea in midair. After several heavy blows, the scattered sword lights were blocked by other sword lights, and the sword lights gradually recovered in a short moment. Transforming into a sword is really unexpected. Xiao Hua's eyes narrowed slightly, carefully understanding the difference between the transforming sword swordsman and the illusory sword swordsman. After the fusion of the sword intent and the sword spirit, the sword intent is rarely used to drive the sword chi. Instead, the sword light is directly used. I'm afraid that the sword heart is used to control the sword. This seems to be the essence of the flying sword. Watch this young master, Xiao Hua thought as his figure flew in front of the sword light of the lotus flower. With a woo sound, he waved the wishful steel staff and smashed it on the sword light. Boom! A hole as thick as a bowl appeared in the sword light. It was the wishful steel staff that smashed it. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.